Agora. Eu disse isso, mas lá está. Olha, não sei onde é que a minha colega pôs a comunicação que ela pôs, mas também já não mando o nome da comunicação. Está bonito, realmente a minha comunicação. Acho que diz FFMS qualquer coisa. Eu venho-nos apresentar dados de um projeto que foi financiado pela Fundação. Caso devia ter perguntado à Marisa onde é que ela pôs. Se abrir é assim um roxo que dá-se um bocado por conta dos olhos. Mas... Para ver se os alunos agora. Exato. É a primeira sessão a seguir ao coffee break da manhã. É Diana Maciel e Paula Campos. Ou melhor dizendo, é Paula Campos e Diana Maciel. É. MS. É isso. Já não lembrava do nome que eu tinha dado ao cliente.
We want to try. Podemos já tem aí os slides da professora Gina Rippon? Já está. Sim. Sim, já. Olha, eu então queria fazer uma coisa que era pôr os meus e a professora Gina queria tentar experimentar. Como é que ela pode fazer? Lá embaixo?
Não, sim. Sim,
ok.
Se puder projetar,
depois you put go down and try to. But I have.
Do you have your phone? Because I walk around it. So
I don't think so, but don't worry.
No,
I think
you don't have anything like
Yes.
No. One of these. I'm not good at this.
Até tínhamos aqui já preparado.
They have it prepared. Será que pode pôr aí a última key concepts? É a última alteração. Para a mesa, logo também a seguir. A seguir à mesa é a primeira mesa.
É aquela da aplicação que eu guardo de ela logo a seguir ao coffee break também.
Mas eu posso falar, está aqui
Que conceito, exatamente.
Em streaming até vai ficar, mas vir até aqui é mais complicado. Não. Nós não queríamos também incentivar as pessoas a virem, não é? Claro, foi
O streaming foi no último momento, não é?
Mas ainda não recebi a pessoa lá na Faculdade de Medicina que queria estar em streaming.
Agora outra vez no Twitter, mas
Sorry, just is giving. Não, eu apenas queria que me desse, que é para ir para baixo. Não, depois, não pode passar. É só porque eu agora estou preocupada para ela tentar, que ela quer tentar como está. Muito obrigada. E agora, quando for para tentar, eu peço lá de baixo para ela experimentar. Ou ela vai experimentar lá.
eu vou projetar a primeira logo, de 10 em 4, está bem?
Olá, que bem.
Mas é porque tem medo de chegar tarde, então, mas eu vi mais cedo que vim de ler, ainda tinha que estar mais cedo que eu. Então, cheguei bem.
Nós estamos
Vou tentar encontrar aqui uma coisinha para pôr já a pé. Era interessante. Sabe? Então, mais para o mel e penso, e vem até os cavalos.
se apontava para depois de roubar e nos roubar alguém.
Então é melhor pôr já a minha, não é?
Sim, sim, nós estamos a fazer isso. Estou muito bem, tem que ser.
Vai chover mesmo. Agora está agora tenho.
Bom dia, como está? Tudo bem?
Para a Amélia,
Paula, tudo bem?
e a Fabiana.
Bem?
É vir mesmo e não
Estou preocupado, eu aqui a continuar a usar. Ora bem.
Muito obrigada.
Tem várias coisas. Mas diz como.
Sei só.
É?
Ok.
É essa. É essa. Porque uma está em português, outra está em inglês. A mesma que diz. Se puder abrir e confirmar que está com 2 títulos, um em português e outro em inglês, vai ser só para a tarde, às 3 horas.
Ok, thanks.
You want to put it in mode of presentation?
No, just seeing where it says slide.
Oh,
Is that
yeah. No, there.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
right? Okay.
Okay.
And then is it? Is this or
can you pass there?
yeah?
Bye-bye.
Is it this one to change? To change here? Whichever. Yeah, that's like that.
Whichever,
Or you can use this. Right, and does that have a printer as well?
Está em inglês. Porque uma está em português, outra está em inglês, mas tenho a certeza que essa é que está em inglês. Está um em português, outra em inglês. É isso.
I get rid of this now.
Isso mesmo, é isso mesmo. Porque eu depois tenho cópias para falar em português, porque senão ler inglês e falar português não custa. E portanto é isso mesmo. Pronto, é isso. Obrigada.
Sorry, I can't get rid of it now. Do you want me to? Also, I've diminished it.
Muito obrigada. There, on the, there, you can.
But it's still showing up.
I'll go to the presentation. There, here. And then.
Displace it.
Yes.
Okay.
You stop
that looks good.
escape, okay.
And when I want to start?
We will
You will
start
start it.
for you.
Okay.
Yes.
Everything automatic.
Right.
I will-
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
It's going to.
Oh, right. And I might just take the loo first. Is that the loo? The toilet.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Então, afinal, vamos precisar aqui de... Isto está funcionando, não está? Está a ouvir-se a minha voz. Este aqui. Não estão passando. Então, diga-me lá. Este aqui, para darmos então à senhora. E ele gasta. Confirme.
Como estava a explicar a outra,
Sim.
estava aqui.
Sim.
Estes dois são para quem estiver no debate em cima do palco. Estes dois são para a plateia. Estes estão sempre ligados.
Ok.
É para não andar em cima da nossa câmera.
Se nós estivermos ali em cima da mesa,
Pode pôr exatamente em cima da mesa. E estes são para quem...
olá. Está bem, não era muito. Ok, ainda bem. Olá. Volto para mim. Como é que sentamos as pessoas? As apresentações que a pessoa faz aqui na frente.
Todas. E depois senta-se ali.
Depois pode sentar ali também, estar aqui. Depois no debate, se calhar é mais simpático.
No debate não se pode.
Não sei.
É, o que acho bem,
Acho bem.
Isso é nesse caso, como a Brigida está a discutir, então ela fala e depois
Podem sentar, ela
Então, muito bom dia a todos. Vamos dar início a este dia de trabalho. I'm going to switch to English. We have foreign guests, so we're going to do the opening and I guess many of the presentations in English. So I would like, first of all, on behalf of our medical school, to welcome all of you. It's a great pleasure to host this meeting here today. It's a joint venture between the medical school, Lisbon School of Medicine, and Iscte with Professor Anália Torres here with us. And together we've been organizing this day today on a very relevant topic, which actually is cross-sectional. It's around many different areas that we've been, particularly in the last few years, addressing and focusing more and more, which are issues related with gender, and particularly today we're going to talk about gender mainstreaming in medicine and medical research. And this is also in the setting of a special program, the iStars program, which is included in an ERA chair that we have here at our medical school. And it links what is also very relevant today, which is data science, all issues related with how we can use data to improve medical research, to improve medical management. So it's a broad area, but a very relevant. And we've been at this medical school trying to increase more and more our exposure and our access to all these different fields related with this topic. The problem of gender in medicine, in science, is very broad, of course. And we know many of the issues that we currently face, but it's also interesting to see that these issues have been identified, but like many things in medicine, we have the diagnosis, but many times it's difficult to implement strategies that can actually treat, if we want, some of the diagnoses that we make. So our understanding and my understanding of many issues related with gender have to do with the fact that sometimes it's relatively easy to identify the problem, but it's more difficult to develop strategies that can actually overcome the problem and implement those strategies on the ground. And that applies across the board, from medical research, from the bench, I would say, to the bedside, using an expression that we use very much in medical sciences. So it is with great pleasure that we again welcome this meeting here today. I want to thank all the people involved in the organization of this meeting. First of all, Professor Anália Torres from Iscte and all the team that has been working with her. Professor Brigida Riso from our team here. She's dedicated to the iStars program, Professor Abreu. And of course, when you start to name people, of course, you always forget some, but all the others that I'm forgetting, I'm also thanking on behalf of our medical school. So it's going to be a long day, but I'm sure it's going to be a very fruitful day. And I'm sure that at the end, we'll feel that we've accomplished something, and we're very much grateful to all of you that will participate in this meeting. And of course, a very special thanks to Professor Gina Rippon, who is with us today. She's going to give the first lecture. She's our keynote speaker. She will be properly introduced afterwards. But I really want to thank you for being here with us and for taking the time to work with us in this very, very relevant topic for all of us, and in this case for our medical school. So without further ado, again, thanking all of you, and I will hand over to Professor Anália Torres. Thank you so much.
Mais para baixo. Bom dia a todas e a todos. Good morning. So, dear Professor Fausto Pinto, coordinator of the project iStars, dear Professor Gina Rippon, our keynote and special guests, we are deeply grateful and honored for you having accepted our invitation to share with us your profound knowledge on the subject so relevant and so dear to us. We'll certainly learn a lot from you, and hoping also that you enjoy being with us. and it will come again. Dear Professor Abreu, co-coordinator, Professor Ruy Ribeiro, dear guest speakers, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Let me also express my gratitude to Professor João Cabral da Fonseca, Director of the Faculty of Medicine, for making organizational issues easier. Dear colleagues, a very short story to explain how and why we are together. We, meaning CIEG, the Interdisciplinary Center for Gender Studies, the only research center in Portugal totally dedicated to gender studies, and graded twice since its existence in 2012 with excellent by our National Scientific Foundation. Sorry for the propaganda. A center located at the School of Social and Political Sciences, meaning we together here, together with ISTAR's coordinator and Faculty of Medicine. In 2000, a very short story, I told you, in 2018, Professor Ruy Ribeiro contacted me as CIEG director to involve us in supporting of a candidacy of the Faculty of Medicine for an era share research project. And it was STARS, Informatics and Statistical Tools for the Advancement of Research Success, a project of Lisbon School of Medicine, funded by the European Union. ISTARS will enact through transformational, what was the goals of ISTARS was enacting a transformational change that will promote excellence in research, better data science, and a lot of other objectives. But the project also complies to the European Commission goals that, as defined, 6 key priorities that oriented the European Research Area Vision in H 2020 and Horizon Europe. More effective national research systems, optimal transnational cooperation and competition, and research into infrastructures, open labor market for researchers, gender equality and gender mainstreaming in research, optimal circulation, access and transfer to scientific knowledge, and international cooperation. Our participation in the project was related to one of the 6 priorities defined by the European Commission for the European Research Area, and that is gender equality and gender mainstreaming in research. And this conference was one of the deliverables of the project. All along the conference, in different papers that will be presented, we will have the opportunity to listen to different approaches that will show the relevance of having a gender perspective on medical research. Are we asking the good questions? Or on the relevance of gender perspective on medical practical, how gender issues and perspective impact on patient-doctor relationship, and also how gender issues, gender norms, gender bias impact on quality of life and interact with biology and influence health issues for everybody, women, men, non-binary people, and other intersect categories, social class, race, disability, age. Now let me just consider some topics to finish. Gender equality constitutes the knowledge field, like any other knowledge field, besides being a social justice issue. But when we are biologists and talk about our field, it is not expected that the listener has an opinion about what are we saying. But when we talk about gender, everyone, of course, has opinions and feelings about it. That is why people that are not familiarized with the topic because they do not have studied it are often surprised with the results that scientific research on the gender study field reveals so clearly. In fact, the knowledge we acquire concerning gender issues is so ingrained in our life as gender persons that living in our bubbles, we do not have conscience of our pre-notions and prejudices. So as scientists, we must insist in showing the relevance and also the social impact of our knowledge production, as well as grounding very well our research procedures, fighting against easy answers, common sense and stereotypes, or any kind of trash, inspired here by Gina, Rippon, Neurotrash. So if science in any field and should be for the improvement of everybody's lives, medical research, medical practice, and health are certainly a domain where this purpose is obvious. On behalf of CIEG, I am really very grateful for having the opportunity to participate in this project and really hope that this cooperation will extend in the future. Thank you.
I think this is working. Is this working? It's working. It's working. Oh, nice to meet you. All right, I'll wait for you. I'll wait for you.
Então, muito bom dia a todas e a todos. Bem-vindos a esta conferência. Vamos dar início aos trabalhos e é com muito gosto que estou aqui para vos apresentar a professora Gina Rippon. É a nossa convidada especial desta conferência e que nos vai certamente inspirar com a sua conferência de abertura. A professora Gina Rippon é uma Emeritus Professor of Cognitive Neuroimaging at the Aston Brain Center, Aston University. É Past President da Associação Britânica para as Neurociências Cognitivas. A sua investigação envolve técnicas muito atuais e inovadoras de estudo do cérebro para investigar desenvolvimento cerebral e problemas de desenvolvimento, como por exemplo relacionados com o autismo. A sua investigação também envolve o uso destas técnicas para explorar processos sociais, particularmente aqueles associados com questões de sexo-género. O seu trabalho tem desafiado mitos que reportam estes gender gaps, estas diferenças, estas desigualdades, como estando ligadas a diferenças essencializadas nas pessoas, naturalizadas nos cérebros masculinos e femininos. É uma apaixonada apoiante de iniciativas que se dirigem e que abordam as questões da subrepresentação das mulheres em todas as áreas de influência, especialmente na ciência, e é defensora de uma compreensão da neurociência de pertença, diria eu, a neuroscience of belonging, como uma abordagem, uma forma de abordar e compreender, e explicar e analisar os tais gender gaps. Tem sido também uma crítica muito forte do neurotrash, que é o uso populista da ciência e da investigação neuromédica para representar de forma errada a nossa compreensão sobre o funcionamento cerebral e para, no fundo, reforçar estereótipos. O seu livro sobre este tema, The Gendered Brain, foi publicado em 2009. É, portanto, uma enorme honra, um enorme gosto tê-la aqui entre nós esta manhã. Professor Gina Rippon, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. It's really a pleasure and an honor to have you among us, and we'll be certainly very inspired by your talk. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm very bad at keeping time, so I have my own personal timer, which unfortunately tends to go off at the wrong time. Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you. And thank you so much for asking me. The honor is mine to be invited to a symposium such as this. And the question I'm going to ask is based very much on my own research, but it is of more, hopefully, of more general interest. I will stand out from behind the podium because otherwise you won't see me. I hesitate to speculate the podium was designed by a man, but we'll move on from that. Two things I'm really pleased about. First of all, we're talking about gender. As you will see in the next 45 minutes, I think the distinction between sex and gender, or indeed whether there should be a distinction between sex and gender, is part of my own research, and I think part of of what we should be addressing in these kind of issues. I'm also pleased to see the term mainstreaming, because I think that's really important. I think for too long, there's been a kind of acknowledgement that sex as a biological variable or gender might be interesting to tuck away somewhere in the corner of a project, and a box gets ticked if somebody like me comes and gives everybody a talk. But I think the key thing is that we are now coming to realize that understanding the gender as a variable, the impact of gender on any aspect of medicine is really important. It's important because it means we should be asking different questions, hence the title of my talk. And it should be important because I think we will come up with different answers. So without much more ado, I will just quickly say I am a brain imager. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, as was mentioned, and I work at Aston University in Birmingham in the UK, and very fortunate to be able to use state-of-the-art imaging techniques. So I spend a lot of my working day metaphorically rummaging around in people's brains, but I'm interested to know what makes brains different. A lot of early neuroscience was to do with trying to find the common factors in everybody's brains. I'm really interested in what makes brains different, particularly with the kind of core aspect of my mainstream research, which is into autism, but also what those differences mean for the owners of the brain, because it isn't just an anatomical question. It's, can we find any differences, and how does that relate to behavior? And how does that behavior relate, if you like, to people's status in society? Or how does it relate to their health or their recovery from illnesses, etc.? So that's the area that I work in mainly. And I would say in the UK in particular, there has been a lot of recent attention to the issue of sex and or gender in medicine. And perhaps ill-advisedly, I draw your attention to other people's books. There's a great book by Caroline Criado Perez called Invisible Women, saying much of the research in this world, certainly development of technology, design of body armor, for example, but also looking at some pharmacological research, has kind of ignored women and said, well, we'll take man as the default option, and we'll assume the same principles apply. And as I'm sure some of you will know, that hasn't always worked out well. And there's also the issue by Eleanor Cleghorn and Rebecca Big, which suggests that women have somehow been sidelined in medicine. Either their pain, for example, has been ignored as just something that they have to put up with, as you know, the fact that they have some kind of reproductive capacity. So all the pain they have is linked to that and the difference in pain thresholds. Or there's also been women who've had a particular kind of illnesses which medicine hasn't focused on, assuming it's just something that affects women. So I think it's important to know that we are asking questions about this. And what these particular books are saying is that we need to pay proper attention to sex and gender differences. My book, just to add that to the mix, is that absolutely right. We do need to pay proper attention to sex differences, but we need to know where those differences came from. Is it just because one group of people have one set of chromosomes, another group of people have a different set of chromosomes? Should we be even thinking in binary terms, which is a whole other area? But I'm also saying that the focus on sex as a biological variable is very much based on the assumption that biology will find the answer only in biology and will find the answer only in internal biology. So, for example, asking questions about whether somebody's a male and what kind of brain they have, whether somebody's female and what kind of brain they have. And I'm saying we need to be very careful. We need to look at the biological impact of sociocultural variables. So our attitude towards different minorities, be they female or ethnic minorities or people with disabilities. Very important that we understand that those too have a biological impact. It's not some kind of internal process. So moving on then, I think this is the take-home message, if you like. This is the key message. So if you could imprint that slide on your minds, this is really what I'm going to be talking about. And I think that's important. I'm talking about sex/gender differences in the brain. I've moved on, in fact, to talking more about the fact that these two are entangled. Very old idea about something being either nature or nurture. all of my work is saying that you can't separate those two out. And this is as true of medicine as it is in my own field of cognitive neuroscience. But I think what we need to be careful of when we're, enthusiastically plunging into the area of gender mainstreaming in medicine is to say, why are we asking the question? Why do we want to know about gender? And I think that is really important, because I think there are various answers depending on why you're asking the question. So I've divided these into sort of three categories. First of all, what I have called sex differences in brain disease. We know epidemiologically that on average, and that's a phrase I'll come back to later, more women than men suffer from Alzheimer's, and that has particular consequences, obviously, and that is a question that research needs to address. We know on average that more men than women suffer from Parkinson's disease, and I've chosen those two examples. They're both brain-based disease. Now, it's quite important to realize that, of course, sex as a biological variable will be a key player. But it is even the case that even in that, what looks like a straightforward question, there are other areas that people are investigating. For example, is the greater incidence, historically, the greater incidence of Parkinson's disease in men to do with some kind of occupational hazard? So not just because they were a man, but because they were exposed to perhaps different chemical toxins or more likely to suffer head injury. So that's an important question. The second question is looking at sex differences in mental health. And a lot of that is what I'll probably be talking about for the rest of the session. And that's acknowledging that, again, as I'm sure you know, there are major, on average, sex differences in mental health disorders such as depression, much more common in women, social anxiety, eating disorders, all of those I'll come back to later. So we know that there are different presentations in these disorders, but it's not just going to be a question of, oh, well, let's see if they, which sex responds best to antidepressants, different kinds of antidepressants. So not just focusing on the biology. There are also issues within my own area of research, which is autism, which has long been viewed as something which is characteristically male. And that is certainly an area that I will challenge today, and I'm currently challenging. Because what it then does is bring what I call the male spotlight onto the problem. What kind of questions should we be asking? And finally, there's what is the issue of sex differences or gender gaps in society? I was talking to some colleagues yesterday and talking about maybe over time, the whole issue of gender gaps will disappear. Well, draw your attention to a rather gloomy statistic from the World Economic Forum, who every year for the last 15 or 16 years has been tracking gender gaps in over 150 different countries in the world, and has been estimating the rate of change in those gender gaps towards a kind of, I'm sure, mythical future where every country has gender gaps have disappeared. In 2019, they worked out that the rate of change that they'd been tracking over that time meant that we were going to have to wait 99.5 years before we reached true gender equality. In 2020, post-pandemic, and also 2021, again, they calculated that rate of change and found that it's now gone up to 135.6 years. So a whole generation further on until we reach true gender equality. Now, you might say, well, I'm sure that's, a good social justice thing, and people like me interested in the underrepresentation of women in science, that's an issue. But I think it's also very much an issue for medicine and medical research. Because if you've got an underrepresentation of women in science, for example, who is doing the research? What perspective is being brought to that research? It's also access to healthcare is another issue as well. If there are big gender gaps with respect to access to healthcare, that's also a question that medical researchers will need to ask. So those three areas that we really need to distinguish, because clearly I'm not, as one of the politer things I've been called since I've written the book, a sex difference denier, a bit like a climate change denier, end of civilization as we know it, if we're going to dispense with sex differences. I really do believe there are sex differences which are crucial, but I think we need to really look quite carefully at where those sex differences come from and how important they are. So it's not just the only question that you should ask. Right, now I'm going to draw your attention to what I call the old-fashioned inside-out model of the relationship between brain and behavior and that impact on issues of sex and gender differences in society and culture. And this historically came end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, where there was a big focus on sex differences in the brain. Now, this wasn't a question, this was a given. Early researchers were saying, for example, working backwards from the status quo, women have an inferior position in society, which of course they did at the time. Therefore, they must have inferior brains. So the whole focus of early medical research was finding the source of this inferiority. And characteristically in this kind of research, one of the things they noted early on was that on average, men had bigger brains than women. So the classic size matters, obviously. Men were cleverer because they had bigger brains. And I won't go into issues about how that was dispensed with as a particular myth, but it gives you an idea about the kind of questions that were being asked. But the idea was that whatever it was that caused the differences in male and female anatomy, which of course they didn't know at that stage, also caused differences in brains. So if you had a female anatomy, then you had a female brain. And later on in the last century, big focus on hormones. So clearly hormones was a key aspect of female anatomy, and that gave a female a different sort of brain. Similarly with males, they had a different sort of brain. That meant they had different kinds of skills. So women were very good at being empathic, relating to other people, being sociable, but rubbish at reading maths or any kind of hard scientific maths and things like that. Whereas men, if you had a manly brain, you were really, really good at spatial thinking. You were going to be a great scientist, a great explorer, a great literally leader of literally men. But you weren't very good at understanding emotions and listening, etc. So this was the idea that this was a fixed, invariable, inevitable, hardwired relationship between brain and behavior. So you couldn't change it. So of course, if that is true, that's a very important question or a very important aspect for medical research. Say, well, this is somebody's brain, this is the illness they have, this is the disease they have. Can't change the brain, or the brain, this is a fixed brain once the brain stops growing, and therefore we need to treat, adjust our research and our treatment appropriately. Okay, so bear in mind, as I mentioned, this was at the end of the 18th century, so there was no way of actually looking at intact living brains in intact living humans. This was all, if you like, slightly more sophisticated than guesswork, but not that much more sophisticated. So we get these really earnest right-left brain theories, male-female brain theories, saying, this is why the human race is like it is. It wasn't until the 1990s that brain imaging, such as the techniques I showed you earlier, became more freely available. So we could then should have taken a step back and said, right, let's really have a look at how the human brain works, how that might relate to behavior, or how that might relate to different kinds of illnesses if you were in a medical research. But instead, what happened was the neuroscience research at the time had this great metaphor that everybody was interested in. Everybody, in few certainties in science, but everybody in the world, as far as we know, has a brain. People really interested in brains. So they said, well, we'll use our brain imaging to continue to ask questions about the differences between male and female brains. So the hunt the difference agenda continued. And I think that's important because it meant it was a kind of missed opportunity to say, let's take a step back and find about individual differences in brains and look at variability, for example. We'll come back to that issue as well. So if you looked at the research canon that emerged over the last 30 years, there are thousands, literally thousands of papers which have sex differences in the adult human brain, the developing brain, the child brain, the autistic brain, etc. So you think, oh gosh, the scientists have actually got a handle on this. We know there are male-female differences, so that's great for us because then we can look at those differences and ask questions of interest to medical research or medical intervention, medical treatment, etc. But it turned out that if you start looking at these so-called, huge numbers of research papers, there was no consistent finding. There was no one area that somebody could focus on and say, okay, give me a brain, I'll look at the size of that area or the weight or the thickness of the cortex. I will know that that's a male brain. And similarly with a female brain. You couldn't give me a brain image and say, right, was it a male or a female doing that task? And I think that's important. Any of you coming into my lab, male or female, I can say, I know what your brain's going to look like. So it turned out that the whole idea of male brains and female brains was actually a myth. But nothing daunted, researchers are still producing these kind of papers, sex differences in the structural connectome. So we tend to have moved on a bit from the size of different structures to looking at wiring diagrams and saying, okay, well, maybe the structures won't tell us anything, but let's have a look at how the brains are connected. And I do draw your attention to this because I'm sure working in a medical faculty, you will be looking at research papers, you will be looking at conclusions from research papers, and there are just some tiny clues that perhaps the story isn't as straightforward as the researchers might suggest. So, for example, very famous image at the top, the idea was that they found that male brains were much better connected front to back, female brains were much better connected left to right. And that, of course, supported all sorts of existing stereotypes about women being better at language because they emotional language because they use both sides of their brain, or men being better at visuospatial tasks because that involved anterior, posterior activity. But that diagram was actually based on only the statistically significant differences that they found in their research. It was based on the idea that I think there was something like 34,000 different comparisons, of which about 120 were significant. So they focused on those. And you might say, okay, well, that's a great, that's where the difference lies. But of course, that also ignores the fact that so many more findings prove that men and women's brains are similar, because if they had to look at all of those connections and only find a small number that were similar, that was important to remember. But the researchers themselves are saying things like, taken together, these results reveal fundamental sex differences in the structural architecture of the human brain. Now, any of you who are researchers will know there's a big pressure at the moment to demonstrate that your research has impact. If you want to progress, if you're doing a PhD, if you want to go on to a postdoc, if you're looking for a research position, you want to say your research is, of course, it's important, but you might just overstate the case. I think the term is hype or spin. And of course, these kind of papers then get taken up by journalists in mainstream papers, which then may get passed on to social media, for example. So the end of the chain is that there's people, all scientists have shown there's a fundamental sex difference. So that's something that we need to be really careful about. Because in particular, and I draw your attention to this graph here, that's something which very often gets ignored in the whole area of sex, gender differences. We are not talking about two distinct, believe it or not, populations with respect to brain and behavior. It's not like men's brains are like this and women's brains are like that. Huge amount of overlap in any measure you could take, either in brain imaging data or behavioral data. You get data sets like this, classic, normally distributed curve, but a huge amount of variability within the population and a huge amount of overlap between the two populations. And the key issue is there's a tiny average difference there. And yet all the focus is very often just on that tiny difference, ignoring the variability. And again, those of you who are researchers will know that ignoring the variability within your population is a dangerous thing to do, particularly when you're looking at research or treatment of illness. So bearing in mind that variability is a very important issue. And then, in fact, what people were saying was, having looked at this lack of consistency, we've now got 30, nearly 35, 40 years worth of data. Let's have a look at all the studies that have been done. Let's really have a look and see if we can find a pattern anywhere which says, yes, this is where, consistent finding, even if it's only on average, male brains are like this. And the year before last now, Lisa Elliott in Chicago and her team came up with did a big survey of all the studies that have been carried out looking at sex differences in the brain, size of the differences, areas of differences, areas of connectivity, as many questions as you could ask. And her conclusion, a great title for a paper, dumped the dimorphism. She said, brain imaging to date has found no clear evidence of there being a male brain or a female brain. The brains from women are not different from the brains from men. I'll come back to that because that sounds like an absolute statement. I actually believe that all brains are different. Each brain is different from every other brain, but that's a separate issue to some extent. So what she's saying that all of this edifice of evidence is based on the idea that male and female brains are different, and actually they aren't. And similarly, the experimental psychologists who joined in really enthusiastically to produce a kind of go-to list with respect to this chain of arguments, saying, okay, different brains, what kind of behaviors distinguish men and women, masculinity, femininity, fear of success, nurturance, maternal instinct, whatever you like. And they did a big survey, huge survey of all of the findings in that area. And they came up with much the same finding, that actually male and female behavior overlaps hugely. And the effect sizes where there are differences are tiny. And therefore, we shouldn't really be thinking of categorical differences between males and females. We should be thinking in terms of a dimension, saying where are these individuals that we're interested in on this dimension, because that could be relevant to the kind of questions that we're asking. Right, so our chain of argument is looking a bit fragmented now. Doesn't appear to be any such thing as a male and female brain. Doesn't appear to be clear-cut differences between male and female behavior, which might in fact contribute to sex and gender differences in different kinds of diseases or responses to treatment, etc. So that leaves us with the idea that we've got different kinds of roles which are determined by our different positions in society. So we're saying that we can't take this kind of essentialist view of where these differences come from. And that must invariably impact on the idea of these three questions that I drew your attention to earlier. So there are differences in the brain. There are differences in brain disease. There are differences in mental health. There are differences in who does the kind of research. So where do those come from? And this is, you know, the closing, the second half of what I'm going to be talking about. This is the area that I've worked on. And this is my outside-in model. The idea that the outside world has brain-changing effects. And that's something that we really need to pay attention to. And this is really what we're talking about when we're talking about gender, if we talk about gender as a cultural variable. So we're not dismissing sex differences altogether. We're saying these male and female individuals are part of the world which treats them differently. And that may be what's impacting on their brains. And that may be what's impacting on the diseases we're looking at or treating or intervening with, etc. So what I'm really saying is that now we know more about the brain, and this is, again, in the last 30 years, we have been asking, I think, more sensible questions about sex differences in the brain and where they come from. And there's two particular areas I will just draw your attention to. And it's going to have to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, because each of these slides, as you will realize, is a talk in itself. But the first aspect is what I call the 3 Ps model of the brain. We've always thought of brains almost as vacuum packs. You know, your brain, you're born, although we've overcome that to some extent now. It always used to be thought you're born with your adult number of nerve cells, brains get bigger because you're looking at connectivities. If brain cells are damaged, they don't recuperate. And therefore you have, you know, once the brain has stopped growing, that's the brain you have until you reach a certain unfortunate stage of your life when you fall off the cognitive cliff, etc. But now we know that the brains are actually not just passive recipients of information. They're not just the most amazing information processing systems in the world, which they are, but they are also much more proactive than we realized. We now talk about the brains as predictive texters. Sorry, I'll go back to that. Where we say that the brain is actually generating rules. We are being driven around the world by our brains playing guessing games or gambling games, if you like. Because whenever information arrives, the brain responds to that information, but also metaphorically looks back in time and says, what happened when that information arrived before? Was it a good outcome, bad outcome, something worth doing, something we should avoid, and generates rules. And therefore we realize that the brain is paying much more attention to the outside world, proactive attention, and it's generating predictions. So that a lot of the time we don't pay attention to what's going on in the world because the brain has predicted that it's not important. So don't pay any attention to it. But of course, it then means we have to acknowledge that the brain is out there seeking information. The second P is that our brains are plastic. Our brains do actually change once they stop growing. And this is a bit of an innovation. People didn't realize that. People might say, well, of course they must change. But the models, you know, if you've been at medical school 40 years ago now, you would have been taught that brains didn't change. There was damage, there was disease, etc. But generally speaking, the brain you had was the brain you kept. But we now know that different experiences will impact differently on the brain. And the kind of classic model of this is the black cab drivers in London who have to undergo this amazing task called the knowledge in order to get a license to drive a black cab. Now, the knowledge is the most excruciatingly difficult visuospatial memory task, where they have to memorize the routes, 10,000 routes within 6 miles of Charing Cross, if you're interested in that. I'm not quite sure how they came up with that as the algorithm. But it's not only just remembering where they are, it's remembering how they interconnect, where you could take a shortcut if there's something else going on. And they, of course, have to keep updating it, as things change. Is there a demonstration? Has there been a crash, etc.? So really complicated. It takes on average about 3 or 4 years. Huge failure rates, huge dropout rates. Sometimes takes people as much as 6 years. And I know this because I constantly engage black cab drivers in conversations about their hippocampus in the hope that they will get me to the shortest route to where I'm going. But one of the things they find is that if you look at black cab drivers before they do the knowledge, look at them once they've acquired the knowledge and are practicing black cab drivers, and interestingly, once they've retired, you find that there's particular areas of the brain which do change in size, they get bigger, and the patterns of activation associated with them are more widespread. So the successful taxi drivers do have quite dramatic change. Interestingly, when they retire, that change disappears. So that gives you an idea that the brain changes sort of wax and wane throughout life. So you can't necessarily say, oh, I'm looking at somebody at 20 and allowing even for some age-related changes, that the characteristics of those brains won't change. So that's a really important issue to remember. And the final issue is the idea that our brains are permeable. And I did kind of squeeze that in as the third P. That's really the fact that, again, our brains don't function in a vacuum. Our brains are actually looking at the social context in which they're functioning. And you can demonstrate this. This is a study looking at 2 groups of women, in fact, who were carrying out a visuospatial task. And one group was told, people like you, and I think that's quite an important phrase, are really, really bad at these kind of tasks, but we want to see what happens when we put you in the scanner and get you to solve a visuospatial problem. The second group, exactly the same task, but we're told people like you are really good at this kind of task. So we want to see what happens, how your brain solves this problem. So the brain is presented, 2 sets of brains, exactly the same problem. The ones who were given a positive message, the areas, they made far fewer errors, and the areas of the brain which were activated were the, if you like, appropriate areas, the areas of the brain associated with solving that kind of problem. The people who were given the negative message, not so much activation in the problem-solving areas, much more activation in the emotional areas, the error evaluate areas, the areas what we will call, as I'll tell you shortly, the go, no-go areas, which says stop doing that, you're making a mistake, etc. So as I say, the brain is paying attention to the social context. So just being told people like you are bad at something or good at something will have an effect. So that's one of the issues that we need to bear in mind in terms of understanding the impact of the outside world. The second issue is the fact, what is your brain for? And you might think, well, don't you neuroscientists know? I thought that's the kind of thing you were actually researching. And for a long time, our focus had been on cognitive skills, because we assumed that the success of the human race was the fact that the evolutionary younger parts of the brain were capable of giving somebody the power of language, creativity, problem solving, flexibility, executive function, etc. So looking at cognitive skills. More recently, people have been focusing on social skills and saying, actually, the success of the human race may well be much more related to the fact that we're social beings. We collaborate to solve problems. We work in groups. We talk to each other. We have family units. We have sporting units. We have occupational units, etc. Very characteristic of the human race. And as I'll show shortly, it's a very fundamental, powerful driver that we need to belong. And if we don't belong, then that will affect our behavior in quite profound ways. And so I probably feel a bit ashamed showing this kind of cartoon-like representation. But this is my representation of the social brain network, which is where I do a lot of my work. So the frontal areas of the brain is very much to do with social information, understanding social rules, social behavior, which will also involve things like having a sense of self. So putting somebody in a scanner, showing them a whole list of adjectives and saying, I want you to tick those which you think most apply to you. And then you can see, where that pattern of activation is. Sense of others, what kind of groups do you belong to? What are their characteristics, etc. So we have a big social store, understanding the rules of the world in which we function. And associated that with is an evolutionarily much older part of the brain, actually in an area, in a building. Is this a building which is called after Monis? I don't know. Anyway, he was somebody who worked a lot in this area. But saying that understanding the limbic system, for example, and the positive and negative responses, these parts of the brain are coding social behavior, social outcomes, because we know the brain is out there generating rules. So saying, was that a good thing to do? Do you have a good sense of self? Do you belong? Are you greeted positively by your group? Or is your self-esteem a bit low? Have you been rejected by the people that you'd like to be friends with, etc.? So this part of the brain is coding it. And associated that with this is an evolutionary younger part of the brain, younger than the limbic system, but older than the social brain, the frontal lobes, called the anterior cingulate, and the network associated with that, which I've characterized as like a traffic light system or train points switching system. And this is the area where we find a lot of inhibitory activity in the light of negative experiences. And so I think it's important to realize that we have a braking system in the brain. You can call it, the inner limiter, if anybody knows anything about lorry driving. Lorry engines have a kind of, you can't go faster than this. So we have a built-in system in the brain which will affect our behavior. So I need to move on, I think. Now, this is much more of the work specifically that I do, and I draw your attention to this is about self-esteem. And I think self-esteem is a key issue when we start talking about gender effects in health-related behavior, and also in health epidemiology, etc. So this seems like far removed from looking at drug effects, etc. Hopefully you'll bear with me. When you put all of these things together, it makes me realize that social cognitive neuroscientists like me are actually quite unpleasant people. We put people in the scanners and try and make them feel bad about themselves. So you can get somebody reliving a social rejection experience, or you can actually put them in a video game where they experience being part of a team, and then they experience that team rejecting them. And you cheerily get them to, can you just rate your self-esteem? And I've been in that, and I know it's a cartoon, but I do actually feel quite miffed when they stop, they ignore me. So, my self-esteem does plummet. A whole range of other things, sitting somebody in a scanner and doing a Tinder-like task where you get them to rate people they'd like to meet. And then you show the ratings to people they'd like to give them, and almost invariably they've been rigged to be negative. So that's a negative Tinder experience, just to show that we're, social media. Also, you get people to talk about socioeconomic status, or their status in their workplace, or in the group they move around with. Are you a leader, or are you actually a bit of a dog's body down the bottom? Or self-criticism. You've just received your 5th job rejection in the post. So how much would you like to rate that that's your fault? You should never have applied in the first place. You should have got a better collection of skills on your CV or whatever. So generally we say, make yourself feel bad. Let's have a look at your self-esteem. And what we find is that the areas of the brain which are activated in this system are invariably around that area which I showed you earlier, the go, no-go area. The idea that we've got some kind of inhibitory system saying this is not for you. Do a U-turn when necessary, if you like to think of a sat-nav metaphor. Also interesting is the fact that these areas of the brain which are activated by real pain. So this is not just the kind of metaphorical musing, or I feel a bit sad. This is something which generates a very powerful negative drive in the brain. And I think that's really important to remember. And the second reason I think that's important to remember is that when you look at the activation of these sorts of areas, these are the kind of problems they're associated with. So this is from my clinical work when looking at different kinds of mental health issues, if you like, the second question that I was asking, saying, let's have a look at particular pathological areas where activation in that area is much more characteristic. If you're putting somebody with depression in a scanner, or social anxiety, or people with poor self-image, people self-harming, people with eating disorders, etc. Very many mental health problems, which may also manifest as physical problems, are problems of self-esteem. So this is where we have to say it's not just a question of measuring somebody's hormone levels or looking at receptor sites in order to understand what drugs might work best. We also have to look at a kind of social profiling of an individual. If they're low in self-esteem, for whatever reason, sometimes people have a kind of inbuilt rejection sensitivity, which can affect them. That will affect the inhibitory system in the brain, which will then affect their behavior and can have downstream consequences. Okay, so we're really saying at this point, this is an issue which is important to understand if you're asking questions of medical researchers. The second case study is much more to do with my own research about autism, which I mentioned earlier, which I call the male spotlight problem. Now, there is a joke, which I hope will translate well, is that somebody comes across, this is nighttime, somebody comes across a rather drunken individual rooting around under a street light and says, what's the problem? And the drunk says, oh, I've lost my keys. And the person asking after them says, so is that where you dropped them? And he said, no, I dropped them over the other side of the road, but the light is better over here. Okay, thank you, good. So the idea is if there's a male spotlight problem, if you have an idea in your head that this is where I should be looking, this is where you'll look. And this is very characteristic in autism. And this is the work that I'm working in at the moment, saying very classic from the beginning of understanding autism. It emerged not right at the very beginning, but there was always this idea that autism was much more common in boys. And as time went on, the diagnostic checklists or whatever, the clinical expectations, all of those bought into that stereotype. So they were finding that girls weren't, that if girls presented with behavioral problems and parents who reported this, autism was way down the list. And very often now they're talking about girls or females have started writing their own personal testimonies saying, I was 40, 50, 60. I talked to somebody last week before somebody realized that actually the problems they were having were much better captured by giving them a diagnosis of autism than all of the other labels they'd had, very, very many labels throughout their kind of difficult years, because people said, you make eye contact, you're female, you can't be autistic. And also the diagnostic tools were devised, particularly focusing on characteristic boy type behavior, like interest in weather patterns or numbers or train timetables, etc. And therefore, is your daughter interested in train timetables? No, not particularly, meant that she didn't get a tick. The fact that the parents weren't asked, is she obsessed with a particular kind of pony or pop star or something, or soap opera? And does she spend all of her time collecting as much information about it as she can? They won't ask that question because it seems kind of culturally normal. So these are the kind of issues that the male spotlight problem will cause. People will be ignored. In my own area, there was a survey done recently looking at, sorry, wrong one, I will go back. Looking at brain imaging, it studies of autism in brain imaging research. And they found that 1,400 different studies, more than 30% of those studies only looked at males. So, when I cheerily said, yes, I'll write a book about the neuroscience of female autism, I realized it was going to be a really, really short book, which perhaps would have been a good idea, but not for the female autistic individuals. So this is just a flag saying, this is something that we should think about. Okay, so coming back to this idea that when we talk about gender mainstreaming and we talk about gender, this is not just looking at sex as a biological variable. Let's just take our data, make sure it's sex disaggregated, which it absolutely should be, but say, what do we mean when we seem to have some kind of difference between this group that we called males, this group we call females? And I haven't, as you realize, or may well ask me questions about, said anything about non-binary aspects of sex anyway. So it appears that this is an old question, which maybe it's a question that should be asked, but it shouldn't be the only question. And so, this is the point at which is a kind of exercise, if you're doing one of these kind of seminar things, you could suggest what we might put in the outside world, which we might have to measure. And so this is where I put together a whole load of social variables, which we know will impact on the brain and which therefore might be very important to consider in understanding brain-based differences, but also health behavior, because that's another aspect. So we know that, for example, sorry, this is one of those things that you can't. Yes, that's it. Oh no, not going to work. Fat finger problem. Sorry, things like loneliness and isolation is coming through as a very important variable in health, which can be gendered. I mean, there was a statistic I came across: lack of social connection heightens health risks as much as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So these kind of social variables we really need to take into account. So I think it's great that there is a gender mainstreaming theme in this program, and I think it will allow us to ask the right questions. And we need to look at stress and different kinds of aspects of people's behavior. We need to ask the questions about the outside world and not just focus on what we can see through the microscope. So closing stage is to remind us that we need to remember why we're asking this question. We need to look at the amount of emphasis we should be putting on biological sex and how much emphasis we should be thinking about in terms of sociocultural variables. But sociocultural variables as a biological variable, I think this is closing the loop. We're getting away from the nature or nurture. We're saying these are hugely entangled. And until research of any kind, or social research, if you're interested in gender gaps, until we confront that, then we're never going to get the right answer. So the take-home message is courtesy of a 6-year-old, summarized my whole talk rather nicely. Everybody's brain is attached to the world, and we need to remember that. Thank you. That's all right. Do you want me to answer questions? Is that?
Yes, we
Okay.
have some time for questions. Thank you so much, Gina, for your excellent talk. You can have a seat now, if you want. Because we have some time for questions from the audience, but
Okay.
it was really very
Can I
important and
repeat
rich.
him? Thank you. Yes, I will have some.
So I open now to the audience. E podem colocar as questões diretamente em inglês ou em português, e eu ajudarei a traduzir. Já temos aqui uma questão. Precisamos de alguém com o microfone, que já está aí a chegar.
I'm sorry, I can't do it in Portuguese.
Okay, so I don't know if this is, maybe it might be a bit of a broad question, but I am kind of young, so I only know, I know parts of your work, read the book, I know a few parts, but so I do have a question about that. Of all things that you could have focused on, why autism?
Why autism? I've got this on. Yeah. Why autism? It was a bit of serendipity, actually, because I'd personal confession time. I used to be a paid-up member of the right brain, left brain brigade, male-female brain differences. Very early on, this is where I started my research, and looking at the blame the brain story kind of thing, because my research initially was in schizophrenia, so I was very interested in mental health problems anyway. So I was looking at, there was a model that paranoid, non-paranoid schizophrenia was something to do with the right and left hemisphere. So I spent a lot of time looking at different techniques for eliciting these differences, and spent a lot of time not finding them, which is why I then went back and said, how good is the evidence that there are these differences, which is when I came across the fact that the evidence is very poor. And that was actually in the 1980s, 90s. Yes. And then I started looking at developmental disorders like dyslexia. And then I moved to Aston, where we had access to all of the new, they had just bought a new brain imaging system, and I was brought in to work on that. And there was a kind of niche of developmental disorders, which the dyslexia was part of. And then I was working with an individual, with a colleague who had a side interest in autism. And I knew very little about autism at the time. And I thought this is a fascinating phenomenon, if you like. And so I got drawn into it, and I realized not only was it a fascinating condition, and I use that term advisedly. I know it's problematic. But it characterized so many of the issues I was interested in, including the male-female differences, because I was thinking, this is great. I mean, there are and were autistic individuals identified females as being on the spectrum, but they were quite rare, quite hard. And talking to parents, because I was also part of clinics which were not just looking at dyslexia, but looking at all kinds of developmental disorders. Parents saying how they knew their daughter had a problem. These were even parents with a son with autism. And their daughter was clearly having problems, and they could not get a diagnosis. You know, perhaps she's a bit slow, or she's shy, very quiet. And this went on until the secondary school very often, and then there was a kind of explosion of problems. So autism, for me, encapsulates so many of the areas I'm interested in. Okay.
Hi.
You want me to use this? Is it working? Okay.
Yes.
Sorry.
Hi, hello. My name is Paula. First of all, I would like to thank you for your work. Just to give you a context, 20 years ago, I wrote my master's dissertation on gender biology and culture, trying to disconstruct the thesis of Steven Pinker about innate gender differences being biological. So you and Cordelia Fine are someone I refer very often in my trainings. But the question I would like to ask you is probably very difficult, but it's something that interests me, is what are your views, or what do you know about the studies that are being done trying to prove brain differences in trans people? Yes.
Asked about, that's better. This is why I don't use these. Yeah, I think the transgender is a very important issue, and I'm circling around it because it's quite a hot topic and certainly a very toxic topic in the UK. And I have been approached by trans individuals who wish to medically transition and say, could you scan my brain to prove this is a man? To prove I've got a female brain? So if I then say, there's no such thing as a female brain, and I can guarantee that your brain will be different from other people's, but that's because, I mean, there's a kind of mantra, brains don't just reflect the sex of their owners, they reflect the life they have lived. And I think when you're talking about transgender individuals, they will have lived a hugely different life from cisgender individuals. So all I can say is, yes, the brains will be different, but this comes back to the whole issue, where do those differences come from, and what do they mean? Which is a kind of cowardly answer. There are people looking at, for example, looking at the effects of hormones, people who are taking cross-gender hormones to see how that affects the brain. It's an early area of research. It needs a lot of scrutiny, a lot of oversight, because it's entangled with all sorts of social and political agendas, which doesn't always make for good science. Okay, is that, yeah. Yes. But I do think one of the things I say is that breaking this chain of argument, where there was this inevitable link between your biology at birth and your place in society, what I'm saying is that that link is wrong. Biology is actually irrelevant to the end of that chain, which could include gender identity. And therefore, I find it quite hard that there's quite a big emphasis still on biology in certain parts of the transgender community, who say, I want to be a woman, so I'm going to change my biology. And then there's all the issues about how you define women, which I won't get into.
Good morning. My name is Sara Merlini. Thank you for your presentation. And I have two questions. One of them is related to the last question. Because we are seeing a lot of autism diagnostic related to non-binary people being mediatized, and I would like to know your opinion about it. And also if you find some resistances since the this kind of brain differences is used as a political stance and also has somehow a justification for doing some very stereotypical things in society, or organizing society has a very good justification to have these social roles, and these belongings are usually very traditional. So I would like to know, well, I will say the questions again, sorry. One of them is if you found some resistance by saying that there are no main differences between the brains in your work, and the second one is what is your opinion about this new mediatic idea that non-binary people have autism and therefore they are kind of a mental health problem, you know? Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm having a short-term memory problem here. So autism, yes, there is evidence that there is a higher incidence of autism in transgender, non-binary communities, which is a double-edged sword to some extent. But to me, it makes sense because so much of autism, particularly in women, is to do with identity. One of the strong messages, I'm in the throes of writing a book about autism in women, perhaps ill-advisedly, but lots of interviews. And one of the key messages that is coming through from women who were diagnosed very late, apart from regret of the help they could have had, one of them is saying a lot of relief. At last, I've got an identity. So one of the problems that autistic individuals appear to have is related to this sort of socialization. You belong to an in-group. So if you know the characteristics of that in-group, that kind of defines who you are. If you find it really difficult to belong to an in-group or to understand what makes an in-group, that seems to impact on identity. And so to me, it makes sense that autistic individuals will have less fixed identities than people who've been stereotypically brought up as either male or female. So that kind of relates to that issue. It's a double-edged sword because sometimes people will say, oh, well, because you're autistic, you don't really know that you want to transition. And I think that's slightly worrying because it's actually saying, sort of devaluing this individual's opinion. That was one question. I think I lost track of your second question, sorry.
Sorry, it was a more broad question about if you find some resistance in doing this kind of work, because usually sex brain differences are used political and in kind of many segments of society are like at instance for instance, the church is using a lot this kind of differences, you know, so this kind of resistances to your work appeared or not?
Sorry, are you saying it? Do I get into trouble for doing this sort of way?
Exactly.
Yes, is the short answer. I have actually been deplatformed by a church, which must be some kind of interesting achievement. Yes, because there is a very, you know, in an age of uncertainty, if somebody comes along and challenges what everybody believes, at least we know that men and women are different. But I think actually sometimes the message is conveyed a bit like a straw man. You know, as I mentioned, I've been accused of being a sex difference denier, you know, saying there aren't any sex differences. Of course there are. And there is another phrase which one of the more mainstream newspapers in the UK, The Telegraph, a writer there said, when I'd given a talk, said her work smacks of feminism with an equality fetish. So I kind of think it's kind of interesting if you're interested in equality, it's some kind of perverse practice. So there is a lot of pushback, and there is pushback from within the neuroscience community because there are a lot of people doing really good research on sex differences at the cellular level, looking at receptor sites, etc. So people, you know, I've spent all my life, you know, working on something, and you come along and say it's irrelevant, which I don't. But when you get this kind of translation problem about what a researcher says and then what comes out in social media, it does read like that.
Se não há mais questões, eu coloco uma questão. I have a question. And maybe it's an unfair question to you because you're not supposed to have also the remedy, the recommendation to solve some of the issues that you raised. But since you've studied them, where do you think we should start in order or continue working in order to overcome some of that trash, neurotrash discourses, and mostly to overcome the consequences that these discourses have on people's lives?
Okay, yes. Just the solution in a sentence. Okay. I think neurotrash, I mean, yes, no pressure. Neurotrash in a way, particularly in the university setting, is an easy target. Because certainly early on, it's what I call the Mars and Venus genre, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, and often illustrated with brain images with no scales or explanations at all. This is your brain on chocolate, or this is the God spot in the brain, etc. So it's easy enough to dismiss those, and I think people will be wary of those kind of things. I think what's more worrying is some of the language that's used by the researchers, talking about profound and fundamental, and how that kind of reaches out into the public consciousness. And so there is a genuine belief and a self-belief as well. And I think that's almost the major problem, the kind of self-fulfilling prophecies, stereotypes, which the medical profession may well be familiar with. So I think the issue is in education, medical education, making medical researchers, clinicians, etc., aware of the impact to the outside world. Because otherwise you might be wasting your time. You give somebody some drugs and off they go to their isolated house where they've got no access to any kind of family or social network, etc., and the drugs don't work. So I think it's more careful profiling of both the people you're researching, because I think that's important too, and clinical work. And sort of realizing that, and not dismissing that, because there is a bit of eye rolling, that's just culture. That's the kind of feminist, you should be paying it. Yes, women are lower paid, etc. But I think you need to realize the impact that the kind of social environment has on the brain. And in some cases, more than is determined by inbuilt biological processes. That's a completely unhelpful answer. But I think, more listening. Gender mainstreaming. But I think realizing mainstreaming is actually the phrase, because I think for too long there has been yes, women get different diseases, and men are, more aggressive and alcoholic, etc. And assume that that's the only question you need to ask: is my patient male or female?
Thank you. I would like to ask if on another perspective, you've talked about your challenges, or if you have been in trouble for your outputs and your research, but on a more positive perspective, have you been having some echoes of positive outcomes in practical terms from your research, for example, in academia or in any institution where, these have been translated into different set of policies or different practices? I know that, it's difficult to achieve social change in such a short time period, but still, if you have been having echoes of good things that have been happening thanks to your research as well.
Okay. Yes, thank you for the question. A variety of things. I was part of the Fawcett Society in the UK, which is interested in gender equality, or the lack of it. Commissioned a research program looking at the effects of gender stereotypes in the early years, because as part of my book, I really emphasized that what we don't realize is that babies are these tiny social sponges. So we assume that these kind of helpless individuals with very poor cognitive skills, we don't realize that they are soaking up all of the social information around them from day one, if not before. So they commissioned a big research project looking at the effect of gender stereotypes in the early years, and that has had a lot of impact. And there is now several programs looking at gender stereotypes in nursery schools, for example, because quite often it's unconscious, you know, and boys line up on one side, the girls on another, and nobody's really thought about it. So that's been quite useful. And actually the fact that people like me have been invited to events like this. I was involved in an EU program in the Horizon, the last iteration, being British, of course, now I'm not eligible. Horizon 2020, which was actually looking at gender imbalance in mainstream science. And so I spent a lot of time at string theory conferences and particle physics conferences, which was challenging. But what they were saying was that, you know, we desperately need more scientists. And if you look at the underrepresentation of women in science, then, you know, they've got to come from somewhere. And trying to find out what it is. And that again leads to this whole idea about, you know, you need to belong to a culture. And if the culture is not very welcoming, then you'll go somewhere else. And so I have hopefully been more than just a tick box where I've gone to talk at a string theory conference and got the string theorists to notice that there aren't many women. And you know, they said, well, they could come and be string theorists if they wanted, you know, and so actually talking through the processes there. So yes, I think having these conversations and getting the feeling that they're serious conversations. I keep coming back to mainstreaming because I think that's so important.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It was really fantastic, and it's more a comment than a question, but then you may follow up, because I think this type of research and outcome, I think it's a big improvement in the way we can address better gender bias science, and as you mentioned, in terms of how much that has been discussed now, fortunately for some time, but this really puts the emphasis on what you just mentioned about the lack. So basically we have different brains, but not based on gender. And I think that's a big statement. And that's something that even in the medical field and the scientific field is not so well, I would say not so well understood. And that sort of message, I think it's probably one of the most powerful messages that can actually help to overcome a lot of gender biased topics and gender biased issues that many times are based on misconceptions. And that's why I think it's so relevant that this type of education, in a way, of course, research and then education is so relevant to be used as evidence, I would say, to overcome some of the issues that we still face in our society. So basically, I want to congratulate you for all the research that you are doing, and this should be integrated into the sort of arguments that you can use in all these discussions that we are having in different fields, in the medical field, in the scientific field, about overcoming all the gender issues. In my field, I'm a cardiologist. We've had now different societies around the world, trying to face, because we are facing several issues related with gender biased attitudes in the field. And I'm going to I took some pictures from your slides, and I'm going to take this to my own field. So thank you so much.
I'll send you the well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think the key issue is also to remember why we're asking the question, because sometimes it's a kind of general eye rolling, feminists are at it again. I've spent all my life looking at receptor sites in zebrafish or something, and I can prove to you that there are sex differences. So I think that's an issue, which is, but thank you for your comments. Thank you.
I think we could absolutely continue discussing this with you and having the. Thank you so much for this very interesting and important topic that you brought us this morning. And let's have a break, intervalo agora com coffee break. Thank you very much.
Este está a funcionar sim. Então, bem-vindos novamente. Welcome back again. We are going to start with our second session, Gender Issues in Medicine and Health. Some presentations will be in Portuguese, others in English, but I hope we can understand each other. So our first speaker is Professor Abreu. She is Assistant Professor of Cardiology here in the Faculty of Medicine, and currently she is the Director of Preventive Medicine in Public Health Institute and the Environmental Health Institute Research Center, ISAM, and the Exercise and Cardiovascular Rehabilitation Lab, which is her expertise. I may say this. So she will present gender issues in cardiac rehabilitation.
Is okay? Good morning, everyone. This is a difficult task to speak after our great speaker this morning. I loved your presentation, really. But I am a cardiologist. I work very much engaged in cardiac prevention and cardiac rehabilitation. Actually, I'm the president-elect of the association, the European Association of Preventive Cardiology, and this is a topic, gender issues, which are very, very near to what we think it's important in prevention, because there are so many differences. So starting with my presentation, we have several facts that everybody knows. Cardiovascular disease is the main cause of death in everyone, but mostly in women. Women have a worse prognosis after infarction, after STEMI. Younger women have higher hospitalization mortality rate for infarction than young men. Acute coronary syndrome outcomes and comorbidities are worse in women. Women lose more remaining life than men after myocardial infarction. And also, there are a lot of cardiovascular diseases which are specific from women when we see them, and they are not linked to atherosclerosis, like Takotsubo, for instance. So in women, coronary artery disease still remains understudied, undertreated, underdiagnosed, and despite improvements in the last years in mortality, there is still a significant gap between women and men. And the difference of outcomes and potential life lost after acute coronary syndrome for women are really stressing the need for more research. And the research is into biological and psychosocial factors and barriers to care. So let's see something about prevention and rehabilitation. Cardiac rehabilitation has been for long recommended in a lot of guidelines from the European Society, American Society, and other scientific societies. But what is cardiac rehabilitation? I'm sure that many people know, but many people might not have the correct definition. So it is a multidisciplinary intervention, structured, very well structured, multi-component, and it is performed by a multidisciplinary team. And the components include exercise training, but not only, because people think rehabilitation is gymnastic, is exercise. No, it has exercise, but it also has the nutritional intervention, psychological intervention, lifestyle modification, and many other things like adherence to treatment, which is quite important. So you can see a picture of our team of the hospital program, because cardiac rehabilitation has the first part, which is after admission inside the hospital, and the second part, which is long-term, we do it in Estádio Universitário, in CRECUL, Academia de Fitness, with another team where some people are the same and other people are different, namely exercise physiologists. So you saw the list. I didn't pass all because we don't have the time. I'll go back. You have a list of benefits, but the benefits that is more important of cardiac rehabilitation is the reduction of total mortality and of cardiovascular mortality, which has been very well demonstrated. And these are the two latest meta-analyses which confirm these two benefits. So we have here the Sweetheart Registry, which is a very big registry, more than 20,000 patients after MI, and the follow-up mean time is 4.5 years. And the red line is exactly the curve for reduction of potential risk of death in people who did cardiac rehabilitation. And the blue line corresponds to those who did not do cardiac rehabilitation. So total mortality risk was reduced it was more reduced in people who did cardiac rehabilitation, and inside those who did it, it was more reduced in women. So women gained more than men in this cohort when doing cardiac rehabilitation in terms of risk of death. So if it is like that, why do we have these numbers? Cardiac rehabilitation is really underutilized globally and in Europe and in all the world, but especially in women. And after referral, which is difficult for women, we have less women who want to enter the program than men. And when they are there in the program, more women give up than men, and the reasons are multifactorial. So we have here a lot of differences in the core components of the cardiac rehabilitation program when women engage the program. What happens is that even the evaluation of the patient and the exercise training, the physical activity counseling, and several other components are less active for women than for men. In this study, we saw that there were only 3 components where we had equivalent force in men and women, which was the nutritional component, it was the hypertension management, and it was the smoking cessation. So even when they enter, the attitude toward women is different. So this study, it's a review paper which shows differential response and barriers for women to cardiac rehabilitation. If they can gain more, why do they not do it? So as you see, the response to exercise, individual response, depends on many things. Depends on sex, on genetic predisposition, on race, depends on the geography, the place where the person lives, depends on the disease, depends on the type of exercise she's going or he's going to do, depends on many things. And the response is individual. You don't have the same response for everybody. What we know about benefits, it's about a big amount, a big number. It's not the individual response. So we have a lot of physiological differences. It's not, we might have similar or not different brains, but we have several things that are different. I'm not going to read everything, but if you look to your left, you can see, for instance, the aerobic capacity, cardiorespiratory capacity, VO2 peak consumption is different. It will be lower in women because they have a smaller muscle mass. At the same time, the type of muscle fibers are different in women from men. Women have more type 1 fibers, muscle fibers, skeletal muscle fibers, and male have more type 2, which mean type 1 are less energetic, less contraction. So of course, with exercise, we can modify. A woman can gain more fibers type 2. They can change. Fibers are changeable according to what we do. So exercise can produce us better muscles, much more energetic. We have a lot of other differences in the metabolism of carbohydrates, lipids, and so on. But we don't have the time to discuss it now. So we need to pay attention that there are physiological differences in women response, which requires an adequate adaptation to exercise for women. We should not do all the same. It is not one size fits all. We should adequate the exercise to women. And besides the physical determinants, we should also look at psychological and social determinants, which might need to change a little bit the components of our program of rehabilitation, not only the exercise. So there are a lot of suggestions for daily practice regarding the way of assessing exercise intervention, the way we tailor the exercise program, and improving adherence to referral, because referral is important to improve, but women need to respond positively to this referral. So in this study, in this review, tailored training prescription, more research about physiological determinants of exercise response and methods to improve enrollment and adherence are really needed. And so the research should optimize all the components of the exercise program in women. Which are the barriers for women? We have general barriers for everyone, but these barriers are very important in women. Doctors refer less women and more men to cardiac rehabilitation. Why? I don't know. I refer the same, but a lot of doctors, generally speaking, they send men to rehabilitation and women not. Then women might have the misbelief that cardiac rehabilitation, because they think about exercise, running, they think this is not for me. Then we have the problem, the social problem of women's role in society regarding family, the responsibility of the younger, of the elderly. Everybody's like when the patient goes to the consult and we ask, what is your medication? Oh, my wife knows. So it's always like that. So this role is very important, and it's a barrier to cardiac rehabilitation. No motivation of women to engage exercise programs, the lack of transportation, the distance to the center, the lower economic status because they earn less many times, and the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. And you say to me, but COVID pandemic was bad for everybody. But what happened is that with the closure of schools and of childcare centers, women had to take care more near to their children, to their elderly. So they were more engaged in the family activity. And also unemployment improved in a different proportion for women. We have more unemployment for women than for men. So you can see on your right, this is a paper about a digital home-based cardiac rehabilitation program that we did during COVID for our patients, not only for women, of course, for everybody, and they could do it at home. And this can be a solution for those who don't have the time, and they can do it at home and sometimes in different schedules. So we have these proposed solutions to overpass the barriers of referral and enrollment. There should be automatic referral. In the hospital, you have an infarction, you should be automatically referred unless you have a contraindication. But in the team, a cardiologist will evaluate you and say, no, you have an absolute contraindication, which is really, really, really almost 0%. Then we should have the education of patients and of the population, increasing the awareness for the importance of this intervention. The family information, we should inform not only the lady who is in front of you, but the family. You know, your mother or your wife or your daughter, she has to do cardiac rehabilitation because, sorry, 2 minutes. Okay, I will go faster. We have the alternative approaches, we have the more flexible hours, and we have the tailored CR programs. And we have now the hypothesis to look at women-focused rehabilitation. And this can mean a special program for women with women-only classes, or it can be a general program, but with some components that are directed to women. We can have both approaches. Then we have here a lot of data that I was going to talk, but I have no time. That means that in all over the world, there is not too many places where they are doing now the rehabilitation only for women or focused in women. And this is the same, it tells you the same, exactly, that we don't have only the big centers of rehabilitation, especially academic or very highly paid. These can have this type of programs. These are all the knowledge gaps and future directions where we should invest in our research. And this is the project we are going to start this year in our university regarding a women-focused cardiac rehabilitation. And this will be very interesting. It has an FCT grant. It will be very interesting because we have a lot of information and a lot of learning with cardio-oncologic problem for women with breast cancer. And these results were fantastic. We have just a few women engaged, but it was fantastic in terms of functional capacity and in terms of body composition. So as you know, when you do chemo, what happens is that you lose capacity, your body composition changes. And what we did was not only don't let it go bad, but we improved everything. So exercise, if well prescribed, is really good. This is also a very recent guideline for practice that can help us doing this. And I would finish saying that we believe in challenges and opportunities for specific tailored cardiac rehabilitation in women. And it will be a great opportunity for us. We have there our team at the academic center for long-term rehabilitation. The classes are mixed, not only women, but we'll have those classes there also. And the other picture means the link to the family and the roles and responsibilities. And this is really the end. The call for action from American Heart Association for reducing the burden of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular complications in women. Thank you very much for your attention. This will be our Congress of EAPC in Malaga, where this kind of issues will also be discussed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we are going for the next presentation. My Professor Anália Torres. She is full professor of sociology, and she already introduced herself, but I would like to say that she has been coordinating for long national and international networks research on gender, family, marriage, divorce, work and family, but mainly in gender studies. So
Bom, bom dia outra vez a todas e a todos. Os slides estão em inglês. Gina, you know already this presentation, so it's no new thing for you. I'm going to talk in Portuguese. E esta intervenção é basicamente para as pessoas, basicamente para pessoas não das ciências sociais. Portanto, no fundo, a questão das ciências sociais que estão aqui, que hoje as caras eu reconheço, é uma espécie de revisão da matéria, uma primeira parte. Portanto, é basicamente dedicada, são coisas que nós consideramos básicas nesta área. Bom, portanto, por que é que falamos de sexo e género e necessidade, o que eu vou fazer é fazer a diferenciação histórica e conceptual dos dois termos? Porque é que isto é importante, porque é que é importante falar sobre desigualdades de género? E porque é que é importante desenvolver uma perspectiva de mainstream, como temos falado hoje desde o começo, na medical research, na medicine e em health? Bom, muito rapidamente, o que nós podemos perceber que as questões do sexo e do género têm uma história, a história dos conceitos e a história de como evoluíram os conceitos, e, portanto, numa primeira fase que nós diríamos que era no final do século XIX até meados do século XX, ou primeira metade do século XX, a medicina, a biologia, a psicologia não distinguiram entre sexo e género. Estava estabelecido que as diferenças biológicas determinavam os comportamentos, que esta relação entre biologia e comportamento é uma questão fundamental, e que não só o comportamento, como as características, a personalidade, os traços de personalidade, as maneiras de pensar eram diferentes e opostos entre homens e mulheres. E, portanto, era a tal visão dos dois planetas, não é, as mulheres de Vênus e os homens de Marte. E o sexo biológico era igual ao género e era uma visão binária. Macho, fêmea, homem-mulher, masculino, feminino, são opostos, eram, nesta perspectiva, opostos que se complementavam. E, portanto, é claro que complementavam-se de uma forma assimétrica, não é? Complementavam-se sempre que o homem tinha uma posição de maior estatuto do que as mulheres, e as mulheres as mulheres profundamente marcadas pelas questões da natureza, da biologia, com características de tipo particular, e os homens eram o ser, digamos, neutro, universal, racional e o referente quando se falava de pessoa. A pessoa era igual, a pessoa, em termos gerais, era igual, correspondia ao estereótipo do masculino. O trabalho que a professora Ligia Amâncio fez há muitos anos desmontou completamente esta ideia. Bom, na segunda fase, temos uma visão que começa a distinguir sexo, que é considerado uma associação que está associado, digamos, a diferenças biológicas, e depois género, que então se começa a distinguir como alguma coisa que tem que ver com uma dimensão cultural e que, no fundo, são significados que se atribuem nas diferentes sociedades e nos diferentes contextos sociais ao que se considera ser um homem ou uma mulher. Portanto, as propostas feministas no campo da filosofia, no campo das ciências sociais e na área pública e no campo político conseguiram mostrar foram elas que trouxeram estas perspectivas, com várias contribuições também, desde o movimento de libertação das mulheres até também, e a segunda vaga de feminismo, mas também os movimentos de lésbicas, de gays e os movimentos sociais de uma forma global. Esta perspectiva, digamos, da ideia da importância do cultural, digamos assim, na construção de uma ideia de género, que está patente, embora a Simone de Beauvoir não usasse essa expressão, está patente nesta ideia básica que é uma pessoa nasce mulher, uma pessoa torna-se mulher, torna-se através da cultura, não é? Portanto, isto representa, no fundo, uma ideia, o que ela faz no livro é mostrar isto de uma forma histórica e analisando as coisas desde a antiguidade clássica e também mostrando como é que isso também é muito interessante o livro, porque ela mostra também como ao nível individual está marcada, as várias fases da vida das mulheres, não é? Estão marcadas por estas perspectivas da forma como elas têm que ir começando a ganhar esta perspectiva do que é ser uma mulher adequada no contexto em que elas estão, em cada uma está. Portanto, é uma ideia normativa e cultural da construção do género baseado no sexo biológico. E, portanto, temos aqui também esta ideia de que género já tinha sido proposta pelo Stoller, a ideia de que esta ideia, portanto, de que o sexo era a distinção entre sexo e género, sexo sendo aqui uma distinção física e biológica, enquanto que o género era considerado aqui um aspecto cultural, sociológica e psicológica, uma produção sociológica e psicológica que contribuía para a percepção e para a compreensão do corpo e da construção do eu enquanto na relação com os outros. Também a Amélia Augusto disse que sexo era e a Augusto não é americana, é da UK. O sexo é um facto biológico e uma constante, mas o género é uma construção social. Portanto, esta é a perspectiva da Oakley, e enfatiza esta separação e mostra que os papéis de sexo são construídos e que eles, portanto, como são construídos, são variáveis e suscetíveis de mudança. E esta questão também é uma coisa importante, porque é, no fundo, mostrando que através das questões da cultura pode haver mudança, obviamente, nestas questões da definição de género. Mas isto estamos em 72. Uma terceira fase, que vem dos anos 80, 90 até aos nossos dias, vários autores começaram a mostrar que até mesmo nas diferenças biológicas, o sexo é muito menos constante do que à primeira vista parece, e de que o binário, num certo sentido, tem formas mais contínuas. E que a discussão de o que é que distingue biologicamente as mulheres dos homens é muito mais complexa, e portanto isto é muito demonstrado pela Ana Fausto Sterling, que mostra, por exemplo, que pode haver de facto, do ponto de vista genético, hormonal e anatómico, diferenças. Por exemplo, uma criança pode nascer com uns genitais femininos ou com cromossomas 2XX e mais um, e sem com 2XX e 1Y, portanto, ou seja, não só 2XX ou 1X e 1Y, mas os três, e portanto e também pode haver genitais com as duas componentes. E portanto, daqui se conclui a Ana Fausto Sterling, que a natureza produz uma variedade de combinações possíveis, em que o female e o male são características num contínuo que se tem que ter em consideração. E, portanto, e também se percebeu que os números das pessoas, ou intersexo, ou pessoas com esta condição genética, anatómica, hormonal diferente, são mais do que aquilo que se tinha pensado. E as propostas também de uma chamada terceira vaga do feminismo introduziram também novas questões na relação entre sexo e género. A sexualidade, um tema que é importante, que já era importante nas vagas anteriores, assumiu um papel cada vez mais central, e portanto o género começa a ser considerado não como uma propriedade dos indivíduos, mas como alguma coisa que nos é feita e que nos é atribuída à nascença, e que nós vamos também fazendo e construindo ao longo da vida em diferentes contextos de interação social. E o género, inclusivamente, pode subverter o sexo biológico, no sentido em que as pessoas, que se torna o que é muito visível nas pessoas transgênero, não é? Transgênero e transexuais. E esta visão performativa do género é importante porque enfatiza a possibilidade de agência, isto é, da capacidade, da habilidade de nós podermos trabalhar sobre a nossa própria biologia, digamos assim, e levantar a questão daquilo que nos pode parecer como constrangedor. E isto também abre a porta à diversidade das identidades de género e a possibilidade do caráter fluido do género, questionando o imperativo da heteronormatividade, ou categorias como o homem e a mulher, e também levantam a questão da possibilidade do não binário ou da identidade queer. E isto é também o que a Judith Butler e alguns autores queer têm levantado. Também podemos sublinhar que as conexões entre género e construção social feita por outros, feita pelo exterior e também feita por nós, e a dimensão biológica estão extremamente interrelacionadas, e portanto difícil, de tal maneira que a própria Gina Rippon hoje de manhã já se utilizou esta visão, que é que nós não conseguimos falar de sexo e género de forma separada, nós devemos falar de género e sexo, gender, sex / gender, ou gender select, conforme, e para mostrar que exatamente os dois termos estão extremamente interconectados. Somar em síntese o conceito de género como atributos do sexo e não como atributos, como o conceito de género como sentidos atribuídos ao sexo num particular contexto sistema social, uma construção social, e o biológico não determina o comportamento, ultrapassagem da visão binária, concluindo que há mais fluidez do que se tinha pensado primeiro, mas, na minha perspectiva, não faz sentido deixar, não é possível, nem é útil deixar de usar as categorias male-female. O que devemos fazer é acrescentar e não substituir categorias, portanto, numa perspectiva interseccional. O biológico e o psicológico são diferenças entre homens e mulheres. Existem essas diferenças, mas também, como vimos, são pequenas, mas aquelas que existem devem ser tidas em consideração. E exatamente, por exemplo, no campo em que estamos a falar, no campo da saúde, é alguma coisa que é muito importante ter em consideração e justamente abandonar o masculino como a categoria neutra que se aplica a tudo. Portanto, há uma diferença, uma forte relação entre o social e o biológico, entre estas duas dimensões, e essas têm que ser estudadas de forma profunda. Para acabar, só muito rapidamente dizer-vos que todas estas questões já estão nos manuais, nos journal, em revistas de referência. Há muito tempo que estas questões já vêm sendo, nós temos um atraso muito grande em Portugal relativamente ao facto de estarmos, por exemplo, aqui provavelmente as primeiras vezes que estas questões são abordadas desta forma na Faculdade de Medicina, mas há uma literatura já muito vasta sobre estas questões. Há um número da Lancet, em vários números da Lancet, por exemplo, está uma conceptualização muito pormenorizada do que é que são cada uma destas coisas que podem, para pessoas que não são da área das ciências sociais, podem parecer estranhas, mas é muito importante que sejam adotadas nesta área. E para digamos, terminar, as normas de género configuram o comportamento e as atitudes também nas questões de saúde. Portanto, o que é que está mesmo para finalizar, o que é que está em jogo quando se fala de desigualdades de género? Precisamos de percebê-las como propriedade, como produto das posições simétricas entre homens e mulheres nas esferas da produção, reprodução e da sexualidade. Esta assimetria traduz-se numa hierarquia que valoriza o produtivo relativamente à dimensão reprodutiva, implicando, de facto, a ideia de subordinação da mulher em relações de poder e nas relações de decisão, e que, numa perspectiva simbólica, o cuidar que tem sido atribuído ao feminino também tem efeitos subtis na socialização e vai-se sentindo ao longo da educação, nestes processos de socialização, e que é preciso ter em consideração que é preciso contradizer estes estereótipos. Nós precisamos também ter em conta que há dimensões conscientes, mas também inconscientes, que explicam estas desigualdades e que, através de uma dimensão mais transversal, de ter a perspectiva de que o género é experienciado de formas diferentes de acordo com a classe social, com a raça, a etnia, com a orientação sexual e também com os contextos sociais. E, portanto, como as gerações, as regiões, as nacionalidades e a idade. E que os constrangimentos de género operam tanto nos homens como nas mulheres, como nas pessoas não binárias. Muito obrigada.
Thank you. We are going to try to move a little bit faster now. Now we have Paula, Campos, Pinto, and Maciel, both from Iscte-IUL. I cannot say in Portuguese and in English, but from the same research centers, and they are going to present gender inequalities in health, Portugal in the European context.
Muito bom dia. Vamos então falar sobre desigualdades de género na saúde, localizando Portugal no contexto europeu. Só mostrar-vos a estrutura da nossa apresentação, ou seja, vamos começar a falar sobre esperança média de vida, anos de vida saudável e a autoperceção de saúde. Depois passamos para os comportamentos associados à saúde, vamos perceber quais são as diferenças entre homens e mulheres. Depois as doenças e o acesso aos cuidados de saúde, as causas de morte e depois as conclusões. Os dados que apresentamos fazem parte de um projeto de investigação que nós fizemos, coordenado pela professora Anália Torres e financiado pela Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, em que tentámos analisar as relações de género ao longo da vida e por vários grupos etários, começando pela infância e juventude, depois o que nós designámos de rush hour of life, que é o período dos 30 aos 49 anos, em que há uma sobreposição de responsabilidades e de sobrecargas familiares e profissionais, e depois a fase tardia da vida ativa, ou seja, antes das pessoas saírem do mercado de trabalho. Utilizámos para contextualizar Portugal no contexto europeu, utilizámos dados estatísticos oficiais, ou seja, o Instituto Nacional de Estatística, o nosso e dos outros países, através do Eurostat, por exemplo, a OCDE, o INE, e depois utilizámos também as estatísticas oficiais de alguns organismos do governo, do Estado português, para além da Pordata também. E depois, às vezes, utilizámos também dados de inquéritos internacionais que também vão aparecer por aqui. O que é que nós percebemos neste projeto que nós desenvolvemos? Nós não queríamos perceber só as diferenças de género na saúde, o projeto era mais vasto que isso, tinha questões da educação, o mercado de trabalho, os valores, a família. Então percebemos que homens e mulheres têm perspectivas diferentes sobre cada uma destas dimensões, mas também têm vidas diferentes. Ou seja, não é só a forma como veem estas dimensões, mas a forma como vivem estas dimensões. Mas também há semelhanças, claro. E então queríamos perceber como é que essas vivências e perspectivas diferentes, e às vezes semelhantes, têm implicações depois na saúde, e é isso que agora vamos passar a ver. Então, como disse, vamos agora falar sobre a esperança média de vida, os anos de vida saudável e a autopercepção de saúde. Temos aqui um desenho, digamos assim, de as estatísticas médias das idades com que homens e mulheres chegam a um determinado ponto da sua vida. Por exemplo, temos a idade do primeiro emprego, a idade com que casam, a idade do primeiro filho, no caso das mulheres, e depois vemos no fim a esperança média de vida. E vemos que isto é para a Europa, que as mulheres têm uma maior esperança média de vida do que os homens. Só temos... depois temos então o número de anos de vida saudável, ou seja, percebemos que a média europeia é de cerca de 63 anos para os homens, 64 para as mulheres, mas vemos que Portugal está bastante abaixo. É dos países com o menor número de anos de vida saudável e as mulheres têm sempre o menor número de anos de vida saudável, como também já foi falado aqui hoje. Neste caso, em Portugal, as mulheres têm 58,7 anos de vida saudável e os homens 60,8. Depois, a autopercepção de saúde, e aqui é importante realçar que este gráfico diz respeito a homens e mulheres dos 16 aos 44 anos de idade. Ou seja, quanto mais idade os homens e as mulheres têm, tendencialmente pior é a percepção de saúde, está bem? Por isso isto é a perspectiva mais positiva, digamos assim, de saúde. Como vemos, Portugal é o país onde homens e mulheres têm uma pior autoperspectiva de saúde, está bem? Então, está mesmo no fim da linha. E, tendencialmente, em Portugal e na maior parte dos países, as mulheres têm ligeiramente uma autoperspectiva ou autopercepção de saúde ligeiramente pior. Mais uma vez, outra questão que é importante realçar, estas são as pessoas que, quando tiveram que descrever como é que era a sua percepção de saúde, disseram que era boa ou muito boa. Depois havia outras respostas, normal, má ou muito má. Estas são as pessoas que disseram boa ou muito boa. Agora vamos para os comportamentos de saúde, ou seja, como é que os nossos papéis, as nossas expectativas de género e as próprias vivências que eu falava há pouco, que são diferentes e as perspectivas que são diferentes, como é que isso depois vai transformar também nos comportamentos associados à saúde. Então, uma adesão através da socialização de comportamentos estereotipicamente masculinos, nomeadamente a independência, alguma agressividade, um ser destemido, não é? Pode estar negativamente relacionado com comportamentos que promovam a saúde, ou seja, geralmente está mais relacionado com comportamentos de risco relativamente à saúde. As mulheres, no entanto, exatamente pelos mesmos motivos, ou seja, porque têm a socialização também relacionada com os seus papéis de género, os papéis de género e expectativas é que são diferentes, isso vai proporcionar que também tenham comportamentos diferentes em relação à saúde, ou seja, têm mais comportamentos promotores da saúde, mas têm uma relação mais complexa com o seu próprio corpo e com a sua autoimagem, dado também a pressão para a beleza e para a magreza, e isso leva, por exemplo, aos comportamentos de distúrbios alimentares. Agora vamos ver alguns dados. Vemos, por exemplo, que em todos os países da Europa, vemos que os homens consomem mais álcool que as mulheres, e a diferença ainda é considerável. Temos Portugal mais ou menos no meio da tabela. Temos agora aqui o consumo de tabaco. Mais uma vez, os homens em todos os países da Europa consomem mais tabaco do que as mulheres. Aqui já não é tão regular a diferença entre os países. Há países em que a diferença de género é maior e outros é menor. Portugal está mais no fim da tabela, sendo que eu esqueci-me de referir Os gráficos estão sempre organizados por ordem decrescente das mulheres, ou seja, é essa a ordem, por isso é que os homens às vezes aparecem com as representações um pouco desordenadas, mas como vemos, Portugal no consumo de tabaco pelas mulheres está na base quase dos valores. Para terminar, temos o consumo de frutas e vegetais, em que, mais uma vez, as mulheres têm comportamentos mais saudáveis, ou seja, consomem geralmente mais frutas e mais vegetais, também pelo cuidado com a sua própria imagem e forma física. Agora vou passar à minha colega, a Paula Campos.
Obrigada, Diana. Falamos então agora sobre doenças e acesso aos cuidados de saúde. Também a literatura nos vai dizendo que existem aqui diferenças de género, relativamente, por exemplo, aos reportes de dor crónica, quer em termos da sua frequência, quer em termos da intensidade ou da duração, e também nas doenças do foro psiquiátrico ou crónico, portanto, com uma maior desvantagem para as mulheres. E, de facto, este gráfico mostra-nos que há aqui uma prevalência, é um gráfico retirado de dados do European Social Survey, e que nos mostra efetivamente uma prevalência das mulheres no reporte de doenças como a dor de costas ou do pescoço, eu bem sei, nas articulações e também, naturalmente, muito comum a questão das dores de cabeça, onde vemos também ali uma grande diferença entre homens e mulheres. No que diz respeito às doenças prolongadas e aos problemas de saúde prolongados também por sexo, também encontramos mais uma vez este gender gap, esta diferença de género, com as mulheres reportando mais frequentemente estas doenças de longo curso, e Portugal sendo um dos países, aliás, no contexto europeu, onde essa diferença também mais se nota e onde as mulheres mais reportam este tipo de situações. No que diz respeito à doença e à dor crónica, para além disso, é de realçar que as mulheres também mais frequentemente reportam problemas de sono, que se acentuam à medida que elas envelhecem, e também sentimentos de depressão são mais frequentemente diagnosticados nas mulheres do que nos homens. Por exemplo, nos nossos dados constatávamos que as mulheres portuguesas na tal fase final da vida ativa, dos 50 aos 65 anos, reportavam mais vezes do que os homens terem se sentido deprimidas em algum momento na última semana, 55% versus 31% nos homens. E, portanto, este é apenas o gráfico que demonstra isso mesmo. Também as mulheres tendem a ser mais medicadas do que os homens, é também um dado que já vem sendo conhecido e debatido na literatura, e Portugal é mesmo um dos países da Europa com uma maior proporção de mulheres medicadas. Também são as mulheres que reportam, em média, tendem a reportar mais ausências ao trabalho por problemas de saúde. E Portugal aqui não está nos casos em que isso acontece com maior frequência, mas, apesar de tudo, essa tal desigualdade de género está presente. Por outro lado, também a literatura nos vai dizendo que este relato de menor ou bem-estar, de menor saúde por parte das mulheres, pode estar também relacionado com uma maior frequência dos cuidados de saúde. Portanto, as mulheres, pela sua vivência, pelos seus papéis de cuidadora também no seio familiar, tendem a ter uma maior proximidade com toda a esfera dos cuidados formais, portanto vão mais vezes ao médico e indo mais vezes ao médico recebem mais vezes diagnósticos do que os homens. E isso mesmo é-nos demonstrado aqui neste gráfico, por exemplo, uma diferença bastante significativa ali no que diz respeito ao médico de clínica geral. Apesar desta maior frequência dos cuidados de saúde, é interessante também verificar que, ao mesmo tempo, são as mulheres também que reportam mais necessidades não satisfeitas de cuidados de saúde. Portanto, isso devido quer a problemas financeiros, quer à distância face a esses cuidados de saúde ou até às listas de espera com que se confrontam. Finalmente, aqui no que diz respeito às causas de morte, é interessante verificar neste grupo etário dos 0 aos 29 anos, em Portugal, os dados do nosso estudo, encontramos de facto uma muito maior exposição dos jovens do sexo masculino a situações de risco e violência e causas externas de morte, acidentes, quedas, afogamentos, ataques violentos por aí fora, fazia com que se invertesse até aos 25 anos a prevalência dos homens, do sexo masculino, que até aí vigorava, na população portuguesa. A partir dos 25 anos passamos a ter mais mulheres do que homens na população portuguesa. E isto tem a ver com as condições de vida, as tais condições de vida e estilos de vida de homens e de mulheres, os homens afirmando também a sua masculinidade, muitas vezes pela participação ativa em situações de maior risco, de maior conflito e mesmo de expostos a situações de morte prematura. Curiosamente, no que diz respeito também ao suicídio, a investigação tem mostrado que o suicídio é mais frequente nos homens, o suicídio, mas nas mulheres é mais frequente a tentativa de suicídio. Aparentemente os métodos utilizados pelos homens são mais letais, o que levam efetivamente à morte. Portanto, concluindo, o nosso tempo está-se a esgotar e estamos com alguma necessidade de correr. As desigualdades na saúde e este Gender Health Gap já estão bem documentados e também os encontramos no nosso estudo relativamente a Portugal. O género explica ou está associado a diferenças em resultados de saúde, mas também há alguns resultados que são paradoxais. O facto das mulheres viverem mais anos do que os homens, mas relatarem mais doenças que são não fatais, mas que as vão debilitando e incapacitando ao longo da vida. O que é importante é então tentarmos perceber quais são os fatores por detrás destas diferenças. E nesta breve apresentação enunciamos alguns que podem incluir, por exemplo, as tais diferenças nos estilos de vida, nos comportamentos até relacionados com a saúde, a maior consumo do álcool, do tabaco, a maior exposição à violência e, por outro lado, por parte dos homens e por parte das mulheres, os maiores cuidados com o corpo e um consumo, por exemplo, ao nível da alimentação mais cuidadoso, mais saudável, assim como a tal maior proximidade das mulheres aos cuidados de saúde, aos profissionais de saúde. Mas estas diferenças também podem ser explicadas por biases, enviesamentos de género na própria provisão, na própria prestação dos cuidados de saúde. A tal igualdade assumida entre homens e mulheres, em que os riscos e as manifestações das doenças são entendidos como sendo semelhantes entre homens e mulheres, e quando, portanto, a mulher exibe um comportamento que não entra no padrão que foi estudado, que foi normalmente o masculino, não é diagnosticada a situação. Ou então, presumir à partida diferenças absolutas e constantes entre homens e mulheres, que também podem levar a uma desigual avaliação das queixas de homens e de mulheres, que é o facto, por exemplo, das mulheres, quando se queixam de qualquer coisa, muitas vezes isto é associado a outras condições psicossomáticas e elas são medicadas com antidepressivo ou com ansiolítico. Também podemos, como ainda hoje, esta manhã, a professora Gina Rippon nos falava, encontrar um diagnóstico nas mulheres ou um subdiagnóstico nos homens. E, portanto, estas são as questões em aberto, mas que mostram, efetivamente, a necessidade de tomar em consideração, de forma séria, o sexo e o género na prática médica e na investigação clínica. Muito obrigada.
Now we are having the last presentation of this session. Lesbian Women in Clinical Practice by António Manuel Marques. He has a PhD in social and organizational psychology, and he's the director of the School of Health of the Polytechnic Institute of Setúbal, where he also is a professor coordinator. He has been researching sexuality, masculinities, and social psychology of gender.
Bom dia, vivam. Este silêncio ando aqui à procura das palavras para explicar a importância que este momento tem, e depois de agradecer ao CIEG, à equipa do CIEG, este convite, porque efetivamente há aqui uma dimensão pessoal que é importante e partilho com quem está na sala. Isto já é a conversa de gente de uma pessoa que caminha para a idade bastante madura, e de facto eu considero que hoje é um momento histórico, porque efetivamente o facto de estarmos num espaço da Faculdade de Medicina, digamos assim, a dar continuidade a um projeto que já vem de trás entre Ciências Sociais e Humanas, o CIEG, o ISCSP e a Faculdade de Medicina, parece algo que é fácil, foi muito fácil chegar aqui, mas efetivamente há aqui um longo caminho que eu gostaria de assinalar e, portanto, penso que com alguma autoridade, penso, eu há pouco dizia, é pôr um pé na porta, não é que ela estivesse fechada, mas é para que não se feche, sobretudo. E recordaria aqui é uma dimensão pessoal, e estive aqui a fazer mais ou menos contas, que em 1996, isto para algumas pessoas, portanto, há imensíssimo tempo, 96, 97, 98, eu trabalhava na Direção-Geral da Saúde, tive 10 anos lá, e por essa altura, no Dia Internacional da Mulher, escrevi um texto para a comunicação social, a pedido de quem mandava, que se chamava As Mulheres Adoecem e os Homens Morrem, e que eu vi aqui muito espelhada de alguma coisa que já se vem aqui debatendo. Depois, conjuntamente com o Dr. Vasco Prazeres, que está aqui presente na sala, e eu completamente inundado pela inspiração, pela força da professora Lígia Amâncio, que estava com mestrado e à volta destas temáticas, e recordava a velha máxima de uma casa comandada por médicas e médicos, da reação que tivemos quando começamos a introduzir esta questão do género, e a frase foi: géneros só conheço os da Mercídia. Portanto, o caminho é longo, portanto são 26, 28 anos para chegarmos aqui e, portanto, muita coisa mudou e, portanto, temos que nos congratular, apesar de tudo aquilo que vemos para a frente e que ainda queremos conquistar e queremos fazer. Eu aceitei este convite da equipa do CIEG e, portanto, me obrigou a recuar aqui também uns anos atrás de uma investigação relacionada com a relação das mulheres lésbicas com os serviços de saúde, portanto, tem cerca de 8 anos, mais ou menos, 9 a 10 anos, e que fui rever, digamos, porque parece que não há uma desatualização daquilo que na altura, com a colega Conceição Nogueira e João Oliveira, realizamos com um projeto financiado. E, portanto, esta é a temática. Por um lado, temos esta linguagem, estes conceitos da equidade, da subjetividade, da importância de segmentarmos e tailorizarmos, como há pouco alguém dizia, do ponto de vista da diferenciação que existe entre as pessoas. E isso é importante porque já percebemos que do ponto de vista da eficácia esse é o caminho, e portanto a homogeneização das respostas e da categorização das pessoas não nos leva a muito longe. Pensei muito aqui, o facto de estar aqui na Faculdade de Medicina e na formação de futuros e futuras profissionais, e apelar, ou pelo menos recordar a importância que a comunicação na consulta tem, do ponto de vista, mais uma vez, por um lado, do cumprimento dos princípios básicos de humanismo, mas também da própria eficácia, portanto, andará muito à volta portanto, será uma base sobre a qual poderemos falar sobre este assunto. Do que nós sabemos e que a literatura sempre vai indicando, e portanto fui, digamos assim, refrescar as leituras e infelizmente, portanto, digamos, o cenário é mais ou menos constante do ponto de vista das necessidades não satisfeitas das pessoas de quem estamos a falar. Portanto, isto é em termos básicos. Por um lado, depois temos aqui alguma complexidade e também o não saber muito sobre este assunto ou sobre estas mulheres, também não nos ajuda a tomar as melhores medidas. E, portanto, logo à partida já fomos aflorando mais ou menos até agora, ou alguém foi aflorando esta questão da categorização do que é ser lésbica, o que é uma mulher lésbica. Se a categoria não está bem definida, do ponto de vista do rigor dos números e do ponto de vista da categorização de necessidades, de quem é que nós estamos a falar? Portanto, esta é logo uma dificuldade. Portanto, é alguém que sempre foi, é alguém que se identifica, é alguém que tem comportamentos. Portanto, de facto, nós estamos a falar de um universo homogéneo e, portanto, a realização dos próprios estudos logo à partida é difícil fazer uma relação direta entre, digamos assim, entre esta categoria e os resultados em saúde ou o que queiramos. Portanto, à partida assume-se que de facto há aqui uma subestima digamos, da realidade e por falta de conhecimento. Eu agreguei aqui a partir dos temas que orientaram o nosso estudo, que resultaram desse estudo que foi publicado em 2015, e estes dois itens primeiros, as dificuldades na explicitação da orientação sexual, que só por si dá de falar, e a presunção da heterossexualidade como norma nas relações entre estas mulheres e as profissionais de saúde. Por fim, daquilo que nós retiramos, daquilo que também fomos ouvindo, porque foi um estudo depois muito discutido publicamente, com muita participação, tanto de profissionais como de mulheres ativistas nesta área, também nos permitiram perceber o que é que deveria ser, qual pode ser o caminho, e portanto daí tê-las trazido. Por um lado, o que se vai percebendo é que, de facto, há por um lado, percebe-se que seria importante conhecer a orientação sexual, o comportamento sexual, ou, de facto, estas mulheres, que tipo de comportamentos têm, que necessidades têm. Por um lado, há este reconhecimento da parte das próprias mulheres. Em todo o caso, esta ideia do coming out, ou da revelação, não é agradável, é gerador de ansiedade em geral. Portanto, é recear portanto, as reações que possam ser menos positivas, ou a própria discriminação, ou não confiar completamente no sigilo pessoal e institucional, e digamos assim, das formas como estas coisas costumam ser arrumadas, e por outro lado esta necessidade maior, que no fundo, como é assumida, e veremos à frente, como é algo que é um ponto de partida. Portanto, ter que dizer que se é lésbica não se observa, portanto, da parte de outras mulheres ditas heterossexuais. Portanto, há aqui uma pressão também nesse sentido. Portanto, eu estou a falar pelas vozes das mulheres e a partir da literatura e do nosso estudo. Portanto, não fizemos na altura um estudo e que valeria a pena, e, portanto, alguém que queira fazê-lo, ouvir do lado dos profissionais e das profissionais também seria interessante. Portanto, não é digamos assim, não é acusatório, é o que é que estas pessoas narram sobre a sua experiência. Pronto, e aqui isto é sempre o lamento de quem faz estudos qualitativos, é sempre a mesma coisa. Portanto, temos sempre da dificuldade em mostrar dados ou resultados. Mas, em todo o caso, são ilustrações daquilo que eu acabei de dizer. Por um lado, perceber, realmente eu devia dizer, até porque é bom para mim e porque serei mais cooperativa com o profissional com quem estou, e portanto há aqui veremos à frente estas assunções, se tem vida sexual ativa ou opta por dizer que não, porque já sabe, e vamos ver à frente, qual é a conversa que vem a seguir que pode ser desatuada. Portanto, são narrativas em geral mais tendencialmente negativas do que positivas. Portanto, foi estas as versões que nós encontramos e que a literatura continua a confirmar. Esta presunção da heterossexualidade e da aplicação da heteronormatividade não será penso que não é de admirar, lamentavelmente, mas este é o facto que, à partida, partimos sempre dessa norma e depois vamos tirando indícios ou fazendo perguntas se queremos saber um bocadinho mais sobre quem é esta pessoa, se aquele item, aquela problemática, ou digamos aquilo que tivermos a tratar, é importante perceber a pessoa também nesta dimensão da sua orientação sexual. Portanto, tudo isto depois acaba por se repercutir nas perguntas que fazemos, nas reações que podemos ter, ou os profissionais poderão ter, portanto, criam-se vários equívocos e eu não sei se à frente tem alguma transcrição, mas se tem vida sexual ativa, não faz contracepção, mas o que é que você anda aqui a fazer, não é? Você é meio responsável, não é? Portanto, o equívoco é só este, depois é dramático. Depois, há alguns aconselhamentos, como também na mesma linha, tem que fazer contracepção, tem que falar com estou a pensar num material feito por estudantes de enfermagem há uns tempos atrás, e que era, em relação à mastectomia, o material que iriam levar para o seu estágio era, depois fale com o seu companheiro relativamente, portanto, a adaptação da mudança corporal, e eu, pronto, inevitavelmente disse, mas quem é que vos disse que as mulheres todas têm um companheiro? A própria colega, minha colega, que é também um bocadinho desta corda, desta onda, e disse, mas elas são tão poucas, portanto, as que não têm marido são poucas. E, portanto, mas lá vamos trabalhando e todos os dias indo mudando qualquer coisa. Portanto, há uma mulher portanto, que se assume como lésbica, recebe um panfleto, 3 minutos, recebe um panfleto e, portanto, depois fala lá do marido que ela não tem. Pronto, isto são, digamos assim, algumas ilustrações, portanto, sempre não há folhetos explicativos para áreas específicas que são necessidades não satisfeitas por mulheres lésbicas. Relativamente ao sexo seguro, portanto, o que existe é para sexo seguro heterossexual, e, portanto, esta é a realidade. O que é que eu diria? Estamos numa casa de formação, uma excelente casa de formação, estamos na Faculdade de Medicina, também está, digamos, uma representação das ciências sociais, mas de facto é esta questão da linguagem neutra. No exemplo que agora dei, falo com o seu marido, se tem uma relação conjugal, é importante que falem sobre este assunto, ou qualquer coisa que nos permita ser inclusivos sem estar a fazer esta afetação direta. O perguntar, às vezes também, e agora estou a ver isto na lógica do profissional, que é, às vezes, os utentes ou as utentes, neste caso, também não percebem para que é que foi a pergunta. E a pergunta faz sentido, e não é invasiva, não é uma agressão, portanto, desde que ela seja explicada para quê. Portanto, a confidencialidade e a confiança, que devia ser para tudo. Há também aqui, assinala-se muito, e na literatura e também no nosso estudo, que tem a ver com o facto de há práticas sexuais, há linguagens próprias que de facto não fazem parte da formação das licenciaturas, pelo menos, e portanto nós estamos a falar de coisas que elas fazem, não é? Elas fazem coisas, elas falam nos nomes que a gente não sabe. E portanto, se a medicina tem que ser centrada no paciente, não utente, então temos que saber as linguagens de toda a gente. Pronto. E ser capaz de integrar estas necessidades de saúde. Penso que eu hoje acho que estamos num momento que promove também essa questão, portanto, olhar criticamente para os nossos serviços, já não estou a falar só do ponto de vista individual, da própria arrumação do nosso gabinete, de quantos lugares temos, da área da saúde reprodutiva, temos sempre o azul cor-de-rosa, o pai, o material para o pai, o material para, são pormenores que contam imenso para quem vivencia, para quem está nesta posição, e portanto olhar criticamente, será que eu estou a trabalhar de uma forma inclusiva? São aspectos muito, muito práticos. E penso que acabei. Já fui pai. Muito obrigado.
I still don't know what language I should speak, but let's try to open the debate again in English. But if you are more comfortable to speak in Portuguese, please go ahead and take your chance to ask our wonderful speakers your questions. And we have already one.
Bom dia, é um prazer estar aqui. Muito obrigada pelas comunicações até agora. I would like to make a comment on the first presentation concerning cardio diseases, because you probably know about this literature I came across some years ago when I was working on gender and health, which is, I'm not working now. But there was a lot of literature showing how the stereotypical expectations of medical doctors created a bias in treating and expecting and preventing cardio diseases in men and women. Notably, the diagnosis of a cardio problem was much less frequent in female than in male. And this has to do with the expectation that other studies have shown in social psychology that men have to be fit to work. And so cardio diseases are more serious and have more consequences in men than in women. And this creates a bias that has to do with the diagnosis, with the time, the waiting time for men and women who come with complaints to, there were several studies showing how these different measures of this impact with consequences for people's health. In fact, some studies concluded that the likelihood of women having cardio accidents was higher because of this lack of attention on the side of the medical community around them. These were studies made in England. There was a team working in this area in Sheffield University, which probably does not exist anymore. We are all very old, but by the time I worked with them, it was I came across all this literature that you certainly know about too. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Yes, there is a lot of literature. Also, cardiovascular disease in men and women has evolved. In long time ago, women are much more protected to cardiovascular disease. And now I'm talking about risk because women didn't smoke as they smoke now, because nutrition was also different. So now even young women are much more near men regarding cardiovascular risk. That is one point. So a long time ago, we had more men with disease and with diagnosed disease, because the other problem that you talked was that women were not supposed to have cardiovascular disease. Also, women have more atypical complaints many times regarding angina, for instance. Many times they don't feel like a pain. They feel like something that is a little bit strange to the doctor. So, oh, she's very nervous. Okay. So they don't pay too much attention. So, and also regarding complementary exams, exams are more requested for diagnosis of cardiovascular disease to men than to women. So it's more easy to diagnose disease in men than in women. However, now we know cardiovascular mortality for cardiovascular disease is even higher in women. So diagnosis got better, but at the same time, women have more risk factors and more cardiovascular disease, atherosclerotic, besides those diseases that are more specific to women and are non-atherosclerotic. So at this time, we should be very carefully when we look at even a young woman to detect her before she has the event. That's the real time, that's prevention. That's the real time where we can get the opportunity not to let the myocardial infarction happen.
Olá, bom dia, é um gosto estar aqui e queria antes de mais felicitar esta excelente iniciativa e as comunicações tão interessantes que ouvimos até agora. Eu tinha uma questão que seria mais dirigida às professoras Diana Maciel e à professora Paula Campos Pinto, especificamente sobre as razões para uma maior longevidade da vida das mulheres, e aqui também partindo para um discurso um bocadinho mais binário, porque também é de facto as estatísticas e os dados que têm costumam funcionar dessa maneira e são muito interessantes e necessários, de qualquer modo. Penso também, e vimos anteriormente com a doutora Gina Rippon, como, por exemplo, a solidão é um motivo altamente prejudicial para a vida e para a qualidade de vida das pessoas. Se bem recordo, seria o equivalente a fumar até 55 cigarros por dia. E pensando na maneira como as mulheres são cultural e socialmente estimuladas a um maior desenvolvimento nas suas capacidades de comunicação, do contacto, do processo de lidar com as emoções, e consequentemente desenvolverão também uma maior conexão, capacidade de gerar vínculos, de gerar laços. Pergunto-me até que ponto esse combate à solidão também, essa capacidade de criar redes e maiores laços com a sociedade, será também uma justificação para a longevidade das mulheres. Muito obrigada.
Obrigada, Ana, pela questão. Claro que é uma hipótese que faz muito sentido e que teria que ser testada, e está a ser testada. Evidentemente que o suporte social e a pertença a redes sociais é um fator protetor da saúde, também sabemos isto por outra investigação, e portanto poderá ter esse efeito. Eu recentemente estive também num júri de mestrado de uma aluna que tinha trabalhado dados de um inquérito nacional de saúde com o exame físico. E esses dados mostravam uma coisa curiosa que eu deixei ali um bocadinho em ponto de interrogação, mas que era efetivamente a possibilidade de os homens, pelo facto de não irem ao médico, não é? Quando vão ao médico já têm problemas muito mais graves e daí poderem ser também problemas mais fatais, isso poder contribuir. Portanto, há uma mortalidade maior nos homens que é explicada pelos tais comportamentos de risco, a exposição à violência, etc., ao longo da vida, e depois, em fases mais avançadas da vida, aquilo que poderá também explicar essa morte prematura, que já não é tão prematura assim, mas quer dizer, face às mulheres, poderá ser esse facto de os homens não irem ao médico e, portanto, quando vão, os sintomas já estão, as situações já estão muito mais graves, enquanto que as mulheres têm um contacto mais regular e vão mais cedo ao médico. Mas precisamos de mais investigação para provar estas coisas, não é? Para testar estas hipóteses.
Eu queria acrescentar qualquer coisa. Obrigada, Ana, pela tua questão. Eu acho que se nós pensarmos um pouco também nos ensinamentos da professora Gina Rippon, e às vezes eu estava a pensar como operacionalizar a questão da solidão, precisamente como vamos imaginar que nós agora vamos mesmo ter isso em conta e vamos ver como é que vamos pôr um médico a perguntar coisas como, olha, o senhor vive sozinho. Portanto, já estava a imaginar como é que nós podíamos traduzir isto em variáveis independentes e variáveis dependentes e como é que podíamos, de facto, para fazer alguma... Mas de repente lembrei-me há bocado, quando vocês estavam a falar, lembrei-me de uma coisa que foi, que é uma consequência daquilo que a professora Gina, a forma como as coisas são encaradas, é que quando cruzarmos as diferenças entre homens e mulheres, relativamente, por exemplo, às questões das causas de morte, por hipótese, temos também que cruzar, por exemplo, com o fator de escolaridade ou classe social ou rendimento, não é? Porque a probabilidade, vamos imaginar de certeza, vamos imaginar uma hipótese de investigação que é que quando neutralizarmos essa variável, por exemplo, rendimento, provavelmente as diferenças entre homens e mulheres, digo eu, poderão até esbater-se, certo? O que nós precisamos sempre aqui, de facto, é ter este olhar e conseguir combinar várias, e por isso é que precisamos mais de investigação. Ser muito crítico também em relação às nossas hipóteses, não partir logo do princípio que vai haver diferenças ou que não vai haver diferenças, não é? E tentar sofisticar as nossas perspectivas, tendo em conta esta variável, entre outras, e conseguindo transformar, podemos ter mais informação e conhecer melhor a realidade que é que nós queremos,
para melhorar, não é? É isso que eu
gostava de acrescentar uma coisa por causa da solidão e do isolamento, que é, nas consultas eu normalmente tento perceber se as pessoas vivem sozinhas ou acompanhadas, porque isso é um aspecto muito importante. No enfarte, por exemplo, existem mais enfartes em pessoas que vivem sozinhas, são viúvos ou divorciados ou solteiros, do que em casais. Para a adesão à terapêutica também é fundamental haver alguém, a família pode ser um fator que aumente a adesão à terapêutica e muito mais ainda à modificação do estilo de vida. Mas só para dizer que antigamente falava-se muito nas personalidades tipo A, que eram ligados ao enfarte, aquela pessoa que andava sempre a correr, à pressa, nunca tinha tempo, por exemplo, os médicos, personalidade tipo A. Mas hoje em dia fala-se mais da outra personalidade, que é tipo D, e mais do que personalidade, hoje em dia fala-se em traços, e um dos traços que está ligado exatamente ao enfarte é a solidão, é o isolamento social. Pessoas ou que estão isoladas, naturalmente vivem sozinhas, ou porque elas próprias se isolam. Estas pessoas têm mais enfarte do que as outras que têm alguém à sua volta.
Calhar vamos. Ok. Então, mais uma pergunta, já estamos em cima do tempo e depois retomamos a nossa conversa.
Eu só queria acrescentar em relação a esta discussão que, no fundo, a vossa mesa contribuiu para salientar um aspecto muito interessante, que é o efeito das mudanças no estilo de vida. As mudanças no estilo de vida explicam a aproximação de muitos indicadores entre homens e mulheres. O que é curioso para a nossa reflexão aqui é que as mudanças do estilo de vida e as transformações sociais são muito mais rápidas do que a mudança no pensamento social. E, portanto, nós temos um gap sistematicamente entre a pessoa individualmente, que já não corresponde àquele padrão da mulher tradicional, heterossexual, etc., etc., e no profissional que está a falar com ela, mas porque a sociedade também não evoluiu desse ponto de vista, não é? Portanto, este gap temporal é muito importante do ponto de vista de certas práticas profissionais, como a que nos traz aqui hoje, não é? Obrigada.
Mas também o estilo de vida só se consegue mudar se houver um suporte social, porque um indivíduo sozinho a fazer uma mudança radical de estilo de vida é uma coisa extremamente difícil, extremamente complicada. Daí que eu gosto tanto da questão da reabilitação, porque envolve um bocadinho uma série de pessoas à volta do indivíduo, mas só com uma mudança social é que se consegue verdadeiramente uma mudança de estilo de vida. Nós não conseguimos estar a comer, por exemplo, eu estou a falar por mim, estar a comer só vegetais quando toda a gente à minha volta está a comer carne, é um bocadinho difícil, não é? Portanto, esse gap é verdade e é muito importante, mas também é importante depois o contrário, é que o social vai trazer a possibilidade de uma mudança individual. Sem isso eu acho que é muito difícil também.
A última questão e depois encerramos.
Bom dia, e em primeiro lugar queria felicitar a mesa pela organização e a minha pergunta era para a colega Ana Abreu, já que sou médico também, e a questão é esta: apresentou uma clínica de reabilitação, cardio, não é? E nessa clínica de reabilitação a minha questão é esta: quando eu trabalhava com o professor Abreu Gomes há muitos anos atrás, nos anos 92, nós tínhamos uma maior dificuldade na adesão da população feminina à reabilitação. E quando aderia, de uma forma geral, desistia, não havia continuidade porque, de alguma forma, aquilo que nós chamamos muito de determinantes sociais, ou seja, era uma população mais precária, não é? E tinha realmente uma grande questão que ainda hoje se coloca, passado quase 30 anos. Todos nós sabemos que depois de um mês de estar de desemprego, começa a haver um corte salarial. E isso era um dos grandes motivos da não aderência ao tratamento. Fizemos em 2020 o mesmo levantamento do Instituto de Saúde Pública, viu-se que tinha havido uma ligeira melhoria, mas que continuava basicamente igual. Não sei se é essa a sua experiência a nível da clínica ou não. Muito obrigado.
É verdade, obrigado pela pergunta. É uma unidade, não é propriamente uma clínica, é uma unidade estrutural dentro da cardiologia que se estende à medicina física, à psicologia, à nutrição. Continuamos a ter, posso lhe dizer que temos neste momento quase 200 pessoas em programa a longo prazo, que é a chamada fase 3, e das pessoas que lá estão, 30% são mulheres, o que já é uma evolução, mas 30% são mulheres. É verdade que também desistem mais do que os homens, continua a acontecer. O dinheiro é importante, o preço que pagam ali é muito pouco, é um acordo que há com a reitoria. No entanto, na reabilitação de fase 2, que é dentro do hospital, naquela fase inicial, eles não pagam nada neste momento e continuam a também não ir. Portanto, o fator económico é importante, conta também o transporte, por exemplo, que também é uma parte que tem que pagar, o transporte, a deslocação, mas eu continuo a achar que, apesar da evolução da nossa sociedade, e como dizia ali o colega, do tal gap, eu acho que as mulheres continuam com a tal sobrecarga da família, de olhar para os outros, o peso da responsabilidade, e acabam por se esquecer delas ou por ficar para o fim. Isso ainda não mudou completamente. Já há alguma alteração, mas ainda não o suficiente. Continuamos a trabalhar para isso.
Então, damos por encerrada esta sessão e esperemos ver-vos da parte da tarde, pelas 2h30, esperamos conseguir estar aqui todos a essa hora para retomarmos as nossas sessões. Um bom almoço.